All right, well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our latest version of the Research Forum. I want to thank all of our wonderful moderators and panelists and all of our participants today, as well as the audience. We've got a great program lined up for you today, 4 sessions, all related to funding. Our first session, starting in a couple of moments, will be on public-private partnerships, foundations, and using other non-traditional sorts of funding, moderated by Brian Pearson and Matthews Perrett. We'll have a session at 9 o'clock on internal Ifas funding as a springboard, moderated by Damian Adams. At 10 o'clock, I'll be moderating a session on federal funding, and at 11 o'clock, John Butenmiller will be moderating a session on commercialization of research outcomes. All of these sessions will be roughly 50 minutes long with a 10-minute break, but please stay logged in for the entire morning. And also, I'd like to remind everyone to use the Q&A function here for submitting questions. You don't have to wait till the end of the presentations in the session. You can do that anytime. And in fact, if you submit them earlier, that helps us with moderating and making sure to line up the questions for the right speaker. So please go ahead and get those questions in at any point that you want to enter them. So at this point, I'll hand it over to Brian and Matthews to start our first session. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Gilbert, for that introduction. I'd like to thank Dean Gilbert as well as his staff for providing a venue to share inspiring and motivating information that supports excellence here in research at the University of Florida. Today's session, entitled UF Ifas Research Forum, Public-Private Partnerships, Foundations, and Other Non-Traditional Fundings, is the 4th in our series. This will be co-moderated by Dr. Matthews Perrett, Associate Professor of Plant Pathology at the North Florida Research and Education Center. My name is Brian Pearson, Assistant Professor in the Department of Environmental Horticulture, located at the Mid-Florida Research and Education Center. Today we do have 4 presenters, as I previously mentioned. Today the presentations and discussion will focus on how to effectively engage beyond traditional external funding sources, winning and maintaining small grant funding, and jumpstart new enterprise program with limited resources. This is a session that's very close to my heart, as these are some of the methods that I've used to secure funds necessary, pilot funds, to secure larger extramural grants to support my research program. And I look forward very much to hearing from our 4 speakers today. The format today, each presenter will have about 8 to 10 minutes to present. We'll take 1 or 2 quick questions, and at the end, we'll have a period about 10 minutes for Q&A, using again that Q&A pod function. So with that, it is my honor and privilege to introduce our first speaker, Cody Helmer, who is the Executive Director of Development at the UF Ifas Advancement Office. The Ifas Advancement Office, originally established by E.T. York, has been under the direction of Cody since 2013. Cody and his staff work to foster essential relationships and secure private support to advance the UF Ifas land grant mission. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Cody.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here, and thank you all for taking the time. So I guess I've got about 8 to 10 minutes. Normally we do this presentation to small groups of faculty or staff, and there's a little go back and forth with this. We won't have that with this presentation, but we'll try to move through as normal on this. So I had to come up with a title for this. So putting the fun in fundraising was about as good as I could get. That was about 6 months ago, and I still haven't come up with a better one. So you're just going to have fun with fundraising. So let's go back 1. So normally what we do when we jump into this is we have a little Q&A and we ask folks, what do they think when they think about fundraising? What is it that comes to mind when they think about that word and what it means and the connotations of fundraising? And usually what we end up with is these conceptions, or we like to say they're somewhat misconceptions. It's a shakedown, right? That what you're doing when you're in fundraising is you're going out there and you're shaking people down for money. And you know, the classic Simpsons episode where they lock everybody in a room and don't let them out. Professor Knuckles comes out and gets his money. That's not what we do. It's honestly what happens with our relationships with donors is about half the time the donor is the one who's deciding where the money goes and when they're ready to give, and we're just serving as conduits or relationship builders in that process. Another thing that comes up often is the money's going to go to athletics or campus. You know, when somebody's interested in giving money, you'll come in and it's going to be all swooped to Florida football. I'll tell you this later, I'll say it right now, but my entire team of fundraisers we have is, we're all Ifas fundraisers. That's what we're therefore we're only to help out, put money into Ifas research projects, student support, building support, what have you. Another thing that we often hear is UF raised $400 million last year. They don't need my money. And actually we hear that a lot from donors. Truth of the matter is we may have raised $400 million last year, 300 and some million dollars is in deferred gifts. That's money that we can't touch until the donor passes away, or it's coming through, slowly over a time period of 20 or 30 years. And almost all of those monies are going towards a specific cause. So it's not as if we could just share that money equally amongst everybody. Another thing that people often say is advancement is donors that are just waiting to support my program X. And that's also, something that doesn't happen very often. We don't often have a donor who comes to us who's got a pocket of money that's just burning a hole in his pocket. Usually what happens is a donor says, I really want to support one thing. They have it in their head. They know what they want to support. And we have to go that direction. GoFundMe is a good fundraising option. A lot of people come and to us with the idea of GoFundMe. Not an awful thing, and GoFundMe and Kickstarter and the like, they're all good programs. They're maybe not the best for what you're looking for. And I'll tell you really quickly, there's some issues with GoFundMe, especially with the University of Florida. There are fees that are charged to GoFundMe on top of the fees that the University of Florida charges. So sometimes every gift that comes to UF has a 5% fee. GoFundMe, I think, has a 13% fee. So automatically you have the doubling of fees on each gift that comes through. And we have no way of tracking donors. We just get one lump sum of money from GoFundMe. We don't have any clue who those individual donors are, which means you'd never be able to build up a fundraising program from a GoFundMe project. And the last thing that comes up very often when we talk about fundraising and we have these conversations is, let's go have a big event, we'll raise all the money at that event. Let's go have a big dinner, or let's go have a big party, or let's go have a big golf outing. That usually falls very well in line with political fundraising. That's what they do when they want to have a chunk of money come in and everybody's basically paying to go see that person. Academic fundraising is very different. That's not how we generally do things, and it doesn't work out quite that way. I don't know if there were any other comments. I didn't see anything pop up, but those are the gists of the conceptions that people throw out there when we talk about this. So when we look at our shop, my advancement team, our mission statement is we foster the essential relationships and we secure private support to advance UF Ifas land grant mission. That's our entire job. That's what we do. We're here to help you guys out. We're here to help provide money for Ifas in all the ways that we do the land grant mission. That's where our office is located, McCarty Hall, right down the hall from the Vice President's office. And right now we have 10 staff that are in our office with 6 frontline fundraisers. So those 6 frontline fundraisers are working specifically on doing fundraising for Ifas. A little quick description of what we're doing at any given time. So we have a focus on donors that are capable of making a gift of $100,000 or more. That doesn't mean we ignore everybody in between and below that. But that's what we focus on because that's the best range for us to work and try to make the most out of what we're doing. It's a very donor-centric fundraising process. And that means that we are focused on what the donor's intent is, and we try to meet that donor intent to the project that we're doing on campus that's most similar. It's very relationship focused. And you'll see right below there, 18 to 24 month cycle of giving. Essentially what that means is we get to know the donor very well during that process. And again, we're helping them to try to figure out where they best can utilize their money. You don't give money to somebody you don't know or you don't trust. And that's part of what we do is we get trust and get to know the donor very well. One key of this, though, is that we need good partners in the process of fundraising. So as we identify a donor and work them through that 18 to 24 month cycle, we need good partners through faculty, staff, and leadership. And that's really where everybody on this call comes into play. So when we talk about being a good partner, we'll talk about what our side is my Ifas advancement team. We serve with our donor relations at the University of Florida Central model, the Central Fundraising Group. What it boils down to is we have many people, many fundraisers asking few wealthy people for money. which means that Ifas is one of many groups that are trying to get their foot in the door to talk to wealthy people about making gifts back to the University of Florida. We can help manage those relationships and manage those asks, as we call them, and make sure that athletics isn't asking our donor for money or medicine or somebody else. So that's the first thing where we become really good partners in the fundraising process. We can maximize the ask. You can go and ask for $10,000 for somebody 5 years in a row, or we can come together and create a strategy and a plan for asking that person for $100,000 once and maybe create a pledge payment process. Also, we create a lot of strategy around what motivates donors. One of the things that we found is some donors are motivated directly by passion. Some that they love a certain cause or they love a certain project that's going on campus. Some donors are motivated by loyalty. They feel like they need to give back to the college that they came from because of their prior experience. Some of them are motivated by taxes. There is a tax benefit from making a charitable gift, and we find that some feel it's more of a business transaction. So we can help with the strategy and deciding which is what we're working with and what the right number is in that case. Our team's also very good at helping with policies. The UF naming policy is something that's changed in the last few years. So when a donor gives money and they want to put their name on a building, we can help with that whole process and working through what that looks like, as well as the IRS rules on what taxes and tax implications are for those gifts. Finally, the last thing that we can talk about is the stewardship piece, and that's the most important, because stewardship is what we use to help a donor make a gift, feel appreciated, and then make another gift down the road. So recognizing that donor, making sure that we have all those pieces in place, getting them in front of leadership, not only at Ifas, but university-wide through the President's Suite in different ways that come into play there. And then when we talk about partners in fundraising, we talk about where you all play a part in this. So we kind of talked about the part that my team does, but what faculty and staff will often do, introducing us to stakeholders and getting us in that conversation early when there's an option for a potential gift to a project. That, again, helps us build those relationships that need to come into place. Tell us about your projects. Even if you don't have a donor or donors in place that you would like to talk to about helping support the things you're working on, come and let us know what's happening with your project, so we at least have that in the back of our head when we do go talk to donors. Identify new potential donors. Some of the things you would want to listen to that a lot of times I think researchers and faculty members don't hear for is when somebody says, I'm interested in your thing, or I'm interested in helping, or I want to help support. Those are all things that we know mean they either want to be involved in volunteering to do something, or they want to be involved with providing support. But one thing I can tell you is my team will never ask you to ask for money, right? And I know a lot of folks are not comfortable with that concept. I've now been doing this job for 20 years, and I don't have a problem asking somebody for money. You can ask my dad this. I did that to him for 20 years before that. But it does become a little bit second nature with what we do in this job, and we'll set you up as well as we can for success when you have a project that needs support, to find a donor and ask them for money. So I usually like to wrap up these little conversations, and I'm probably getting close to the time that I need to finish up, where we are in this Go Greater capital campaign. And of course, right now we're in a 7-8 year capital campaign that is highlighted and focused on a campus-wide fundraising effort. So started on July 1st, 2014, ending on October 22nd, October 2022. We're not sure when it's ending in October. The current status of the campaign, UF has raised $2.7 billion of their $3 billion goal. So we're 90% of the way there with 2 years left in the campaign. Ifas has done remarkably well. We actually had a lot of concerns about the number we had originally set. For last fiscal year, we had a goal of 28 million. We raised 51 million. And a big part of that was one single huge gift that really kind of skewed our numbers. And as the campaign goes, we've raised 200 million of 178, we've raised 178 million of a $200 million goal. So we're 89% of the way there. Right on track, really, for if you see where the UF is as a whole. So we feel pretty confident about where we're going, but hopefully this will also instill a little confidence in everybody listening to this, that our team can help you with the fundraising effort, considering we've had some past success. So I know that I rattled a lot of things off there in a short amount of time. Again, just trying to give a brief update of what this group does. Last thing I will say on this is as you think about projects that you have that need funding, consider the option of private support. It is something that is there, and most of you on the call probably have had at least some interaction with my team in the past. But we're here to help and identify ways that we might be able to bring donors in to help out your projects. And again, the more that we know about what you're working on, the better off we are in presenting that out to potential donors. So, any questions?
Cody, I have a question here.
Sure.
Are there situations where a group of individuals contribute together for a same cause?
Are there? Yes, absolutely. In fact, we are working on a project right now with trying to create a professorship in honor of a recently deceased faculty member, and it's a group of people who are working together. Usually when that happens, we have an anchor donor, a single person who will put a first, piece in. And sometimes that works as a challenge gift. In other words, I'm going to give you $30,000 if you can raise $30,000, and people will join in that way. But we meet with some success with those. Some do very well, and some, it all depends on what the purpose is.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Cody, for your presentation, for your assistance. I know I've used your office, and the staff have been wonderful and very helpful to acquisition of funds to support my program. So thank you very much for that.
Sure.
We'll go ahead and I do see one more question, but we'll go ahead and hold that to the end just to make sure we have enough time for the rest of our presenters in our session today. I would like to go ahead and introduce our second presenter, Dr. James Estrada, who is a lecturer and director of academic programs for the Center for Stress Resilient Agriculture. James also coordinates the successful UFA2I, the Accelerate to Industry program, in collaboration with NC State. Those of you may be very familiar with this program, but those that are not, the UFA2I program is an innovative symposium that features workshops, panel discussions, presentations, and networking events, all led by industry leaders, and focus on helping participants build key professional skills to give them a competitive edge in the job market. And speaking of a graduate student that attended this, he said it was a wonderful example and an experience to interact directly with industry and to give them some insight into career opportunities in industry. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to James.
All right, thank you, Brian. You did a good intro there for me. I think you cut a few minutes off my presentation, which is appreciated. Let me get my screen share going. All right, so as Brian said, I run the A2I program, or Accelerate to Industry. This would be our third year running the program now. And I put the title today as UFA2I Bringing Industry into Education. And I chose that for a very specific reason. I think a lot of times we view industry as sort of an outside group that can contribute at times, but we try to really bring them in and make them active participants in educating and preparing our graduate students, which I think is a very unique model. So just to kind of get started, I want to give you a better feel for what A2I is. So if you look in agricultural programs in general, I think we're in kind of a unique situation. We have about 80% of our graduate students report that they're interested in at least pursuing a career in industry. And this is a complete 180 from what it was like when I was in grad school and almost everybody was going into academia. At the same time, we have really high turnover rates in a lot of our stakeholder positions. So we're seeing about a 50% job availability over the next 5 years is roughly what we're projecting in industry. So it seems like a great match where we have a lot of students who are entering the workforce. The workforce has a lot of positions that are opening up. The problem is that employers value a different type of student than really what we're producing. So employers value broad interdisciplinary training, and specifically they want people who have very strong, what we used to call soft skills, or what I call accessory skills. And so that's a very different model than a lot of times what we do in graduate schools, where we're making people specialists and we're sort of encouraging independent work. And so A2I was created to help deliver some of these industry identified job skills. In particular, leadership, cultural awareness, teamwork, and mental flexibility are the ones that constantly come up when I talk to employers. These are the skills they want to see students from UF leaving with before they enter their companies. So we deliver these through a series of activities like Brian mentioned. We have workshops, we have panel discussions. Typically each industry or each company will bring 4 to 5 people from their company, and we'll have panel discussions so students or participants can ask questions about their roles within the organization and just get a general feel for what kind of positions might be available in a global corporation. We also do group projects. We introduced one this past year in 2020, which was very successful. And we have lots of opportunities for one-on-one networking between the participants and industry reps. So the overall goal here is really to help ease the transition for students that are moving from academia to industry. And I think that's a focus and a concept that a lot of graduate programs are lacking. So as Brian mentioned too, this is a partnership with NC State. NC State does this a little bit differently than what I wanted to. And so I wanted to come up with a very firm concept for what it was going to look like at UF. At NC State, they work university-wide, so they work through the graduate program. Here, we really wanted to focus on CALs. I thought, especially getting started, this is sort of where my expertise is. This is where I had the most contacts. So we really wanted to focus in on that agricultural sector, but we did want to maintain a broad appeal. And that's played out over the demographics that we've attracted to the program in the past couple of years. So in 2020, we had 34 students attend, and they represented 16 different departments. We've had people from mathematics, we've had people from genetics. So we've had people from well outside of the agricultural sector attend. We did want to attract a very diverse set of companies. Part of this is just helping students understand what kind of positions are available to them and what kind of career opportunities they might have when they leave UF. So I've always gone out of my way to try to get nonprofits, startups, and global corporations all represented at the event. We wanted to reach as many people as we could, so we do keep it open to all graduate students and postdocs. Some of the other programs that run A2I concepts will focus primarily on people who are about ready to graduate. But I think it's equally as important for people who are just starting programs to get a feel for what industry positions are so that they can start crafting their own educational experience to match what their career goals might be. And then the big point, getting to the funding issues, is I wanted this to be self-supporting. I didn't want to rely on outside grant funding. I didn't want to rely on money from the graduate school. I really wanted this to be a program where the industry supports the program and is able to kind of move the program forward. So this is just giving you an idea of some of the companies that we had. This is our flyer from 2019. So we have 3 different levels of sponsorship that companies can go into. So they can do full day membership or full day sponsorships, half day, or what I call special events. For 2019, we had 3 half day. That was Syngenta, Florida Crystals, and Mars. LA Urban Farms and the Nature Conservancy were our special event sponsors. And then it was funny, as soon as JM Smuckers found out that Syngenta and Mars were present, they wanted to show up. So they just flew a couple reps in to give a special lunch session. I won't get into the details about the levels of, the exact dollar figures here, but if at the end, if anybody has any questions, let me know. I will say too that in 2020, Syngenta moved up to a full day sponsorship, which in of itself essentially pays for the event. So that was a huge step up for us to have somebody come up to the plate with that much funding for us. So the big thing here is obviously finding sponsors. And this is where I really struggled in the beginning. I don't know about most of you, but my PhD program did not train me to go ask people for money. So this was kind of a steep learning curve when I first started working with these organizations. It's a different language, it's a different value set, and it's something that I had to get accustomed to pretty quickly. So I just wanted to put a few tips here really of things that I've kind of learned along the way. The first thing is that you need to contact the sponsors personally. And this really involves finding a champion for your program. And this was probably the toughest lesson that I learned. The first name that you come across when you're looking for contacts within a company is probably not going to be the person who's going to end up being a champion for you. So you need to find somebody who believes in your program and who's willing to kind of move your initiative up the food chain, so to speak. And a lot of times this means finding an alumni. So finding somebody that's come from UF that's passionate about the programs, that wants to sponsor it, and somebody who just gets it. Maybe it's somebody who's fresh out of graduate school and had a hard time finding contacts and meeting contacts and figured out that they made a lot of mistakes along the way, and they can see how they would have benefited from a program like this. Now we're getting to the point where some of the alumni from A2I are actually starting to make the recommendations to the companies. And that's where I've sort of always wanted this to be, but it's taken 3 or 4 years to get there. Be as clear as possible with your program goals. This is a huge deal when you're talking about something that's unique like this. Most of these companies are used to job fairs. They're used to just setting up a table, showing up and talking to people. They're not used to being active participants in the program itself. And so really selling them on, this is how you're going to benefit from it. You need to be involved in helping us train these students, and really understanding what the company needs and wants and what they're going to get out of this program is difficult. And it's something you got to spend some time crafting. But once I think you deliver that message, they're much more receptive. I always recommend keeping your ask modest at first. You got to remember, nobody knows what to expect the first time you run a program like this. I had no idea what it was going to do. I'm sure the participants didn't have any idea. None of the industry folks did as well. We were just sort of kind of going through this experiment together. And so at the first year, I asked about half of what I currently do for each one of those tiered memberships. So once I sort of had it figured out and I knew it would work, I went ahead and increased my ask for the second year, and all the companies followed along. And this is probably the most important one. I think when I first started this, I decided I was just going to go out and start calling everybody. And I think I made 30 phone calls over the course of like a day or two. And you'll find that you get a lot of the same response. And it's a lot of people that just want to wait and kind of see what happens. When I saw that that was happening, I sort of refocused and I went back and I thought, you know what, I'm going to find one person. So I kind of identified my ideal participant or my ideal sponsor, and that was Syngenta, and I went after them full force. And so I tried to get Syngenta locked in. And what I found is once I got them on board and I could put them on the advertising and I could talk about them when I called people, everybody else followed. And other groups that are doing this as well have said the same thing. If you can get that one big name on there, the other ones will follow. So that's what I always recommend is to follow that one person and then let everybody else kind of fall in line. Real quickly, just to wrap up here, I wanted to end with some of the benefits to participants. So these are all things that we've gotten as in our exit surveys as responses from students. The first one is access to invested employers and stakeholders. I think you'll see this on both ends. The companies really value having contact with potential employees, and they say that is probably their biggest bottleneck to success when it comes to hiring. And students say the same thing. They don't have access to companies. And so A2I brings those two groups together. They have a better understanding of the career options within these various organizations, ranging from small startups to global corporations. They all comment on how they felt like they had good professional skills when they came in, and they realized pretty quickly that they needed some help in some areas, especially when it comes to mental flexibility and cultural awareness. And universally, they all say that our CV and resume feedback sessions help them tremendously. This year, we introduced mock interviews that students loved, and those were actually, all of these events, by the way, are run by the industry reps. So Syngenta came in and ran mock interviews with all of the students. And this year too, we also introduced salary negotiations, and we've always had interview skills as part of the program as well. So students said that they came out feeling much more well-rounded and better prepared to pursue a career in industry. And so that's really all I have. I'll say just to wrap up, again, this March is going to be our 4th time running the event. We've had, I think, continued growth in the program. We have a lot of future plans and ways to expand it, but I've been really, really pleased with the way that it's going. And there's, Rob was involved in kind of helping us get started. So we've had a lot of help along the way, and I appreciate all of that. All right, thank you.
Thank you, James. I do have one question from Matthews. In fact, Matthews, you and I are on the same page. I was thinking the exact same question, which is the A2I program documenting student hiring into companies throughout the time that it's been in existence as a program?
Yeah, so we've just started to collect some of that data. We go through NC State, and so they have a big grant now, and so we do all of our reporting to NC State. But we've had, so the first year we had 2 internships come of it. The second year we had 1 hire and a couple more internships. And then this past year, we don't have any data on it quite yet, but there were 3 or 4 people who were being pursued by the companies from the A2I event. So we're starting to make some of those connections. Of course, a lot of it's timing as to whether or not the company's hiring and things like that. But with the kind of investments that we're getting from some of these companies, they're using it as a very strong recruiting effort. So yeah, we are starting to see some of those happen.
Excellent, thank you. We got another question coming here. A comment, this is a great program. I didn't know about it. Are there any partnerships with the pharma or biotech non-ag industry? Students doing basic science research may benefit from such partners.
Yeah, and so that's something that we've considered, and this is kind of a balancing act. One of the other comments that we really get from participants is they really enjoy that it's kind of a intimate setting, that it's a small group and it's really tailored for them. So every industry rep there is somebody that they could see being a potential employer. But we have had some, I won't say pressure, but encouragement maybe from the graduate school to expand this and make it a broader offering. And so that's something that we're considering in the future, possibly running concurrent sessions where we have kind of an agricultural focus and then a separate focus. And so we could have some of these skill buildings as a whole group and then do breakout sessions for specific disciplines. So that's something we're looking into. We really haven't ventured there yet. I've been trying to grow the program slowly, but that's certainly something that's on my radar.
Well, thank you very much, James. And thank you for your leadership with this program. Again, speaking as a mentor for a graduate student that participated, he had a wonderful experience and spoke very highly of it. So thank you.
Thank you.
This time, I'll go ahead and turn over the moderator responsibilities to my co-moderator, Matthews.
Thanks, Brian, and the speakers for that very good start to some insightful presentations. It is my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Bola Adesogan, who is a professor in ruminant nutrition in the Department of Animal Sciences. But most importantly, he's also the director of the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Livestock Systems. Bola is leading a lot of programs that's in multiple countries pertaining to livestock systems, and the experience that Bola and his team have at UF and nationally and globally is quite important from the conversation that we are trying to build here. I would like to bring that perspective as a way to look at how Bola and his team was able to get the USAID funding, but also how that USAID funding was used to further enhance funding through the Gates Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. With that, I will open to Dr. Adesogan for his presentation.
Thank you very much, Matthews. Really appreciate the opportunity. So I'll be talking about how we got the USAID and Gates Foundation funding to establish the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Livestock Systems. And Feed the Future is the US government's initiative to combat global hunger and malnutrition and poverty. And innovation labs are programs that fund research for development led by US universities in partnership with foreign universities and agencies to conduct the research. So, let's see. I'll start with the USAID RFA that we responded to, which was issued in 2015. This RFA was really daunting when I saw it first. It required expertise in 12 subject areas, which are listed on the screen there. It also required intimate knowledge of the key research gaps, the policy priorities, the capacity building needs, the main players, and many other aspects in 2 Asian countries and 4 African countries. It required an understanding of USAID's peak and the norms, the rules and regulations, like what airlines you can fly on and what you can and cannot use USAID funding for. So when I saw the RFA at first, I was just put off. I felt it was too much like hard work, and I decided this was not for me. Fortunately, we had a number of faculty, Jeff Dahl, who was chair of animal sciences at the time, Walter Bowen, who was director of Ifas Global, and Sandra Russo from UFIC, from the Office of Global Research Engagement. They all approached me and said, Bola, we think you should spearhead a UF effort to apply for this grant. And as I said before, I was hesitant to do this. I was honored that they asked me to do it. I said, well, I'll think about it. And being a person of faith, I went back and I prayed about it, and I felt I should, but I was really unwilling to do it. So I submitted very reluctantly. And the big challenge was, the biggest thing on my mind was, how can we address all these 12 subject areas? I know a little bit about animal science. I know next to nothing about all these different areas. Fortunately, UF is a place with such a wide range of expertise within IFAS and in the university at large. And so all three of them helped to invite different faculty from different disciplines to form what I call our dream team. And this is just a number. These are the people who helped with writing the proposal, but there were many others who were involved in brainstorming, in thinking this through, who are not listed here. Some people said, Bola, this looks like too much like hard work. I will give you 1 hour of my time for brainstorming, and that was welcome. You know, we said, thank you for that, we'll take it. So we had several meetings, but these folks who are shown here were the ones who really wrote the proposal. Obviously, we needed some people with USAID experience. I had never received a USAID grant. So those whose names are in this reddish color here had significant USAID experience and were able to guide us. It was also important that we had the social cultural scientists in addition to the technical experts, because without them, you can't get the USAID grants. So the faculty leads drafted their different sections, and we had strict deadlines, and if anybody didn't submit what we were expecting, we took it on ourselves to write that section. And when I say we, I mean Marietta and I. And so we collated and shared various revisions till we were in a spot where we felt reasonably comfortable with the technical narrative. The big challenge we had then was the budget, because you know, within the department at the time and within IFAS Global, we didn't have the expertise to put together this type of a budget. Well, finally, we came across Nargiza Ludgate from UFIC, and she was able to help us. So that was a huge relief. And when we submitted the proposal, USAID was reeling from the previous livestock lab, which had been with a different institution, and it hadn't really been a success. So this is a huge investment of funds, and they had to non-renew the lab. So they came with that mindset, and when they were reviewing our proposal and the others, they were very, very skeptical. So even after we were shortlisted, when the top 4, we got a barrage of questions. Even when they decided that they think they want to fund us, they were not sure we had enough knowledge about the country, enough technical expertise. So we had to go through several rounds of convincing them with a lot of humility and patience in addressing all the questions that they posed to us. So finally, we got the contract in September 2015, and we started working on the lab. Now, moving on to the Gates Foundation, the intention of the foundation to co-fund the lab was mentioned in the USAID RFA. But so once we got funded, the name of the funder was not disclosed, but once we got the USAID funding, we started talking to the Gates Foundation. And there was no RFA issued, so they decided they wanted to focus on some of the priority areas we had identified in our work with USAID. So we thought this would be a simple process since they had an agreement with USAID that they would co-fund the lab, but it was anything but a simple process. And in fact, they told us they want us to focus on livestock feeds and food safety. So again, we assembled a team, again, with the social scientists, but this was really an uphill task for us. We discovered that to get money from the Gates Foundation, you literally have to pass through gates 1, 2, and 3. Gate 1 is very simple. It's when your project manager helps you to put forward your application, they put in your objectives, their summary statement, and so on. Gate 2 is a huge hurdle to surmount, and that's when you really have to convince the foundation that you are worthy of their funding. And that took us all of 2 years to get through, and we had several times when they would tell us to address certain issues. We would write a proposal addressing those issues, and then they would tell us, well, we've changed our mind and it's no longer this. We actually went to some countries, went to Tanzania with them, and then they decided Tanzania is no longer a focal country. So it was a very challenging time. They told us it was an iterative process, and we thought, well, iterative process, that's fine, but it should be leading somewhere. And it seemed like we were just spinning our wheels. So I got to a point that several of our faculty thought, let's just forget this. This is not going to work. But thankfully, we persevered, and we were able to talk to someone more senior in the foundation who asked us to come back to Seattle. We had been there before, and we made a pitch, and he felt that we had something compelling. And from that point on, it became not smooth sailing, but we were able to proceed. And so we finally got the award in 2017. And the Gates Foundation also issues RFAs. Now that they know us, many of the members of the Innovation Lab, or some of the members, have now received complimentary Gates funding. And these were through RFAs, so it was much more straightforward. So some take-home messages with getting money from USAID and from the Gates Foundations. A systems approach is very necessary. A multidisciplinary team is critical. Involving the social scientists, they're going to want to see the role of women. They're going to want to see monitoring and evaluation and so on and so forth. Intimate knowledge of the foreign countries, especially the needs of smallholders and how to make a difference, private sector partnerships, that will all be critical. And then focusing on how to impact nutrition and health. So prior to this, I was an animal science professor, and if I could improve milk production or improve the health of dairy cows, I had done my work. But now we have to think about how that relates to nutrition in the home. And so that's also a very important aspect. And then compliance is very critical, and there's an entire team of different offices at UF that help us with that. So with that, I'll end with just a snapshot of the achievements that we've had through this USAID grant, and we're now going to be renewed for another 5 years. Thank you.
Thanks, Bola, for that very good coverage of the sequence and the complexity that went into it, and I'm very glad to see the outputs that's coming. I have one question. Beyond Gates Foundation, are there other NGOs in your knowledge who are also aware, who would also fund additionally if you were to get funding from USAID, similar to how Gates Foundation functions?
Yes, there are several NGOs that we've partnered with, Mercy Corps, Land O'Lakes, CNFA, ACDI VOCA. So there are several of them that we're already working with, and they are also, last 2 weeks, we talked to 2 of them about additional funding for some work in Bangladesh. So often they will now approach us to partner with them for their work in these areas. They focus more on the development side, we focus more on the research side.
Thank you, Bola, for your time. With that, I will now like to introduce Dr. Frank White. Dr. White is a preeminent professor in the plant pathology department, and he has been collaborating internationally on a very important disease on rice, which is bacterial blight caused by Xanthomonas oryzae. And Dr. White is going to share some of the process that went into this collaborative effort through funding from the Gates Foundation, and also some of the key aspects pertaining to that. With that, I'll pass it to Frank.
Thank you, Matthews. I'll try to be quick since a number of the topics have been covered by the previous speakers, thankfully. Our project is much more limited in scope, and I would say perhaps it was somewhat timely when we were seeking the funding. Let me share my screen. Is it shared?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so we applied to the Gates Foundation based on some basic research that we did. And I was joined in this project with Jose Hugue Tapia in the department here upon moving to Florida in 2015. So we applied. The Bill Gates Foundation has been mentioned. It was, again, like I said, it was kind of timely that they started this Grand Challenges program and in 2008, and we applied in 2009. Now, even though this was a much minor project, I also tend to be a little bit hesitant to get involved in some of these things that are more translational, because I'm not an expert in the areas that need to be covered in these grants, but I did have collaborators who wanted to do this, so we went ahead. I should also add that technically UF is a subcontractor to the lead university, and the Gates Foundation tends to give money to one entity, and then that entity's job is to kind of figure out the interactions with the other partners in the case of the Grand Challenges. But this has been a very generous program. You can go to the website. I listed the link there. Most of the opportunities are generally more medical or human nutrition health type projects. But at the time we were involved, there was a agricultural component to it. I think there still is. It's just, I think there just aren't quite as many calls. I should also add that I know colleagues who started out proposing in this avenue, and once it comes to the attention of people in the Gates and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, sometimes you'll get people who are like a champion that was mentioned earlier. You'll find somebody who's interested in that program, and they'll just fund the program without going through their normal process. They'll call you in, you visit maybe Seattle, and then they'll just fund the program without the normal policy. But you generally, it is quite, I won't go through it, but as was mentioned, it's not like dealing with NSF or someone. It's quite involved. They have a lot of eyes on the project, so you have to be prepared for that. So I actually just wanted to mention that I've also been involved early in my career with the Rockefeller Foundation, had somewhat similar program available. So it is as was mentioned, there's phases. We proposed our project, which is called Transformative Strategies for Controlling Rice Disease in Developing Countries. We proposed as a phase 1, or number 1 in the previous proposal. And that is, I don't list the amounts and stuff, but that was that was pretty standard. It was $100,000, and it was basically money to get organized for a year. We did that. We proposed phase 2 that ended in 2017, and there isn't really a phase 3, but we suggested a phase 3 or phase 2B, I guess, and that was funded, and now we're in discussion of possibly extending it, due partly to the virus issues. extending that to the end of 2023. The reason we got involved again was basically we were working on this bacterial disease of rice, which is the most damaging bacterial disease of rice. Rice is, of course, is one of the probably the most important staple crop. Specifically with regard to subsistence farmers and small farmer holdings and in areas of where there's threatened food safety, it's a really high percentage of the crop. And the Gates Foundation wanted to target some of the countries in Asia, and rice is growing in production in Africa too. So, and there is the disease is increasing in Africa. So they wanted some focus on those areas. I just brief science. I wasn't going to go into science. Our project is much more narrowly focused than some of the broader issues that were mentioned in the previous talks. But this bacteria is highly dependent on a protein secretion system that injects proteins from bacteria into the plant cell. One group of these are kind of claim to fame. One group of these effectors goes into the nucleus and turns on specific host genes and then makes the plant susceptible to disease. And if the bacterium cannot do this or the plant is insensitive to this, then you don't get the disease. That was our initial observation. These molecules interact with certain host components, and then, as I said, these lead to the disease. And if these events don't take place, then, and the disease is this blighting of the leaf, and then you get reduced yield. And in young plants, it can even kill the plant. And it takes warm weather, humid weather. So the southeast areas where they grow rice is often highly conducive to this disease. So these effectors enter the plant, as I showed. They bind to a gene promoter, and if they bind, they induce a set of genes we call sweet genes. It's not that important what they do at this point, but what if they don't do that? So then when they do that, then you get, let's see if I can, I guess I'm not seeing my pointer choices, but you get a lesion on the end of the leaf. And then if you disrupt this site of binding for this protein, which we call an EBE, effector binding element, then the pathogen can't turn on the gene and there's no disease. And you see this by clipping the leaf, and you get no progression of the bacteria into the disease. So this is an example of recessive resistance. It has to be on both chromosomes. Rice is a diploid plant. And if you disrupt this EBE, then there's no disease. And it turns out that there's 3 of these genes that the pathogen can target. We call them sweet 11, 12, 13, and 14. So what we propose to the Gates Foundation is that this disease has an unusual dependence on these protein effectors, that they only target 3 specific genes, and that if we modify the promoters, we get recessive resistance. These targets can be readily modified by now CRISPR-Cas, for example, gene modification platform. And so we propose to modify all 3 genes in certain rice cultivars, and that this would provide broad resistance to the disease. So that was basically the proposal, that we were going to incorporate this risk. We were going to monitor the pathogen populations just to be sure that that they targeted, that all the strains targeted these 3 genes. And then we were going to test the plants to see if our modifications had any deleterious effects. And that was basically the project. And so we engaged with different groups who were involved in at least the initial parts of rice breeding programs. And that's the immediate goal, to get these changes into the plants and then see if people will partake in those and put those into a breeding program. I think it was somewhat timely. It's been a great interaction. We get, you know, it's targeted. We have a specific goal, is to produce these plants. It's not exactly the same as basic research, where it's kind of, you just follow the line of inquiry. They have certain tasks that they want done, but at the same time, all these there's a lot of basic questions that can be addressed within the program that also are translational in effect. Like, what is the nature of the pathogen population? How stable is the resistance? How hard is it to get people to adopt it into breeding programs, which is probably the biggest challenge for us, because it's a whole different world. Plant breeding is almost, in some ways, a separate entity that you have to learn to interact with and speak the same language. So, but it's been a very good program. We have a website. I can provide information to people. This is next slide is a list of the people involved, and we just recently provided 2 publications describing our initial work. We have produced lines with the mutations, and we have also produced a kit which is useful for the pathologists and the breeders, even companies, to use to try to characterize the disease in their area, to determine exactly what's going on and how applicable our program is. And with that, I'll end and take any questions.
Thanks, Frank, for that very different perspective from the long association you had with Gates Foundation programs. I have one quick question before we open to panel for a few pending questions. Right now, the Gates Foundation program investment, it seems like, are primarily on staple food, like rice, wheat, and other similar crops. Do you see any kind of initiative at this point from Gates Foundation on other crops like vegetables or other fruit crops at this point, funded or in perspective?
Well, they are. I think they do. They want to tackle big problems, I think. But I was a bit hesitant to, just like previously, I was hesitant to do this because I'm a basic researcher. I don't want to make promises that. But I think you just have to engage in the system and see what they say. That's the best answer I can give. Is that if you couch it in the right terms and you think it's important enough, I think you'll find somebody who will listen to you. If it's just a vanity project or something, or a very local project, I'm a bit hesitant. But if it was in an area where it looks like it would have a multiplier effect in a country or something, and you can make that clear to the agency, I don't see why not.
Okay, thanks, Frank. And with that, I will put it back to Brian for final statement. And if any final question before Cassie can take over to the next session. Thank you, everyone, for this. Thanks. Brian.
Thank you, Matthews, and thank you to all the presenters. I know we ran a few minutes over, so I'll go ahead and end this. I just want to thank everyone for their participation today. I hope they found that interesting and inspiring and helpful to program development. I also want to thank Cassie for all of her hard work, making this easy for us to set this up and moderate this, as well as Dean Gilbert for his continued commitment to having these forum workshops and discussions. So thank you all.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
All right, thank you, everybody. We're going to come back in 10 minutes, so we will maintain the break. We'll come back in 10 minutes and get started promptly at 9:10 with our second session. All right, welcome back, everybody. So this is our second session. This session is going to be focused on internal Ifas funding as a springboard. I'm Damian Adams, Interim Associate Dean for Research.
Joining me on the panel today are Jonathan Judy, Assistant Professor in Soil and Water Sciences, Brett Sheffers, Assistant Professor in Wildlife Ecology and Conservation, and Kelly Rice, Associate Professor in Microbiology and Cell Science. This session focuses on the role of internal funding in building your programs, catalyzing teams, honing your grant writing skills, and generating proof of concept and preliminary data needed to achieve success in what is a highly competitive extramural funding environment. Each of the panelists has a story to tell about internal funding and valuable insights to share. Following a brief, perhaps 5 to 7 minute presentation from each of the presenters, or maybe statement, I guess, because we all opted to not use PowerPoint. We hope to engage in what I think will be a lively discussion driven by your questions. And so as you have questions, please enter those in the Q&A using the Q&A tool at the bottom. And with that, I will hand it over to Jonathan. Jonathan Judy.
Thanks, Damien. So as Damien kind of suggested, I'm just going to kind of talk to you about what I've tried and what I've done and my experience in leveraging these internal funding opportunities for extramural funding. So I've received internal Ifas funding from 2 different sources, the Ordway Swisher Biological Station Jumpstart Program and the UF Ifas Early Career Scientist Seed Grant Program. So if you don't know, the Ordway Swisher Biological Station is a pristine forest research station in Melrose that the university has access to, and they run a program that offers seed funds for research conducted at that site. Obviously, anybody who's applying for internal funds from this opportunity and others, that you're seeking to get these internal funds to try to enhance some overarching goal of your research program. But for me, I had never done any research in forestry, so it wasn't exactly an obvious fit for me to apply for this program. But I went on the tour of this station, which I believe was in August at that time, but I expect that it's not going on this year, which is a really great opportunity to just focus my thinking on what research question I might be able to develop at this site, which might help me develop capabilities that I was interested in developing, which I felt would help me leverage, help me be more competitive for extramural funding, even though I didn't necessarily have a background in forestry research. So that's what I did. So for me, one of the major things I was trying to develop up in my program was around phosphorus and advanced techniques for analyzing the speciation of phosphorus. So I developed a research question that I could look at the Ordway Swisher Biological Station that allowed me to have a platform for capability development. And so I developed up these capabilities, and now I have data sets demonstrating those capabilities that I can use in presentations with funding bodies and grant applications. So the other opportunity that I took advantage of was the Early Career Seed Grant Program. And so the other real big area that I'm trying to build up in my program is around perfluorinated alkyl substances. It's an organic contaminant. So I put in a project around that substance for that call, and was successful. And again, that project is serving as a platform to develop what are really advanced and valuable analytical capabilities here in my department, so that I can be more competitive for more research funding in the future. I was also able, at the same pretty much time, I was applying for federal funding in that same area, and I was able to get an external grant at pretty much the same time. So what I'm hoping is that the Early Career Seed Grant research will also help me kind of build a concentration of research in that area for my CV, which will again help me be more competitive for additional opportunities. I think that's all I have to say. I don't know who's next.
All right, great. Thanks, Jonathan. And yeah, so up next is Brett Sheffers. And I just, again, want to remind everybody, as you have questions, please go ahead and use that Q&A tool. And we'll grab the questions. And once we get to the end, we'll make sure there's plenty of time for discussion. So Brett?
Yeah. So I just want to give a little history because I think the background is relevant. I started my position at UF in 2015, and at the time I was hired under a position on global change biology. And that position was to basically maintain a really strong international research component to my work. My research at UF, so I'm in the Wildlife Ecology Conservation Department. It's basically centered on how plants and animals respond to a range of human disturbances, from climate change to habitat loss, the wildlife trade. It's a diverse research, I guess, program in terms of themes, but my overall interest, I'd say maybe 60% of the research outputs for my lab are climate change focused, trying to understand how species respond to climate change and how that might impact certain components of society. And the reason I'm giving you a little bit of background is I had been living in Asia and Australia. Again, my position is on international research, and I had been living for several years abroad. And so when I made this transition to UF, all of my colleagues, all of my research, everything was international. I had almost no connection, even though I grew up in the US, I had no connections academically to the US. And so a challenge that I faced when I arrived at UF was, one, I wanted to diversify my research program. I didn't want to have all my eggs in one basket. So I wanted to establish a domestic program because everything that I was doing was in Africa, Asia, and Australia. I was eager to kind of establish collaborations with my UF colleagues, but I didn't have a springboard because all my work was kind of very specific to regions. I didn't really have a springboard to make those connections with colleagues. I needed baseline development or baseline data to develop proposals like Jonathan had mentioned. And also a challenge was bridging the gaps between funding. So oftentimes, you know, you start something up and then right when you're gaining momentum, the money starts running out and you're like scratching your head, what do I do? And so a challenge is bridging that between funding sources to keep the momentum through the program. And so I was able to address some of these challenges, or actually most of them, with 2 Ifas grants. Similar to Jonathan, I got an OSBS, the Ordway Swisher Biological Station funding grant, which was to do some research on mosquitoes to understand how they would respond to climate change. So we did a lot of physiological work with mosquitoes, and to better understand how they might respond, how they might expand or contract their ranges under climate change. And then I also was fortunate enough to get an early career award, which was quite a broad award. Basically, again, under the same vein, understanding how species will respond, change their distributions to climate change. So both of these IFAS supported projects were climate change focused. Now, I was able to kind of leverage these different pots of money in different ways. So one, in terms of teaching and mentorship of students, the OSBS funding, I was able to actually kind of like kill 2 birds with 1 stone. I was able to recruit some international students to come over. So I had 1 student come over from Burkina Faso, and another student came over from Pakistan on a Fulbright fellowship. And they were able to complete their master's program using support through the OSBS, the Ordway Swisher funding. And actually, one of the students had this honorable mention, one of the best theses ever completed at her university. So that was pretty exciting. So it helped me kind of build, new to UF, helped me build kind of this teaching mentorship of students program. So they both got their MSc program degrees. In terms of like a springboard in terms of funding, the Ordway Swisher funding, I was able to take that proposal and put it into the Oak Ridge Associated Universities. ORAU has a junior faculty award every year, and I was able to successfully get that award. My colleague on the Ordway Swisher funding was able to leverage that proposal to get a little over $700,000 from the Florida Department of Health understanding how Aedes aegypti might respond to climate change and understand control methods. We were able to take that proposal, almost the exact proposal submitted to the OSBS program, and we turned it, we collaborated with a large UF group to put in a BII Institute proposal just several months ago. It was unsuccessful, but it was a $11 million grant, and now we have that proposal, so we could keep polishing it. So that's the OSBS in terms of the early career. I was able to recycle that proposal into an NSF DEB proposal. That has been unsuccessful, but strong comments, and so I'm still editing that. It led to a successful USAID grant through colleagues in Madagascar. I was able to turn it into a National Geographic Explorers grant. And then also that proposal from the Early Career Award, I was able to turn into, it was just funded through the USGS grant. They have a Southeast Climate Adaptation Center to understand climate change impacts. And so we were able to successfully get that research proposal funded. So kind of to summarize that like laundry list there, but so the two projects from Ifas funded around $100,000 of research. So this is money through these Ifas initiatives, but that 100,000 led to over 13 million in research applications, from which about 1.2 million was successfully funded. So, there's a big return, 10 times from the original startup money. In terms of research outputs, it led to around 9 publications in peer-reviewed journals, so it's about 4 per funding proposal. The Ifas funding basically led to this conceptual framework that we published in Science that I led on climate change impacts in 2016. It then led to another follow-up in paper in Nature Climate Change. And then I mentioned earlier in the beginning that it's important to bridge the gaps between funding pots. So the Early Career Award bridged this gap, and I was able to maintain a postdoc. And one of the nice things about a little bit of flexibility in these monies is that you can use it to really harness creativity and pursue ideas that maybe you wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. And so with the postdoc that I was able to keep with my Early Career Award, we just last year published the work from that. It was a research article in Science on the global wildlife trade. So, I mean, that's it. I can't really stress enough the importance of this kind of funding. It was able to give me flexibility, but also kind of get that basis for kind of catalyzing collaborations, and also put in research and get outputs as well. So anyways, I'll pass the baton over to Kelly.
Great. Good morning, everyone. So this morning, I'm going to tell you a story of how I obtained my first large multi-year grant and the critical role of UF's internal funding opportunities in helping this happen. So just a little bit about me to start. I started working here at UF as an assistant professor in the microbiology and cell science department almost 12 years ago. The research program I built over this time focuses on 2 human bacterial pathogens, Staphylococcus aureus, which is commonly multi-drug resistant, and it causes a variety of potentially life-threatening infections, and the bacterium Streptococcus mutans, which inhabits all of our mouths to some degree and is a major contributor to dental cavities. So because of the primarily human health link of my research program, my main focus for acquiring external funding has been the National Institutes of Health. And I was very lucky as a new faculty at the time, because in addition to my startup package, I actually had a small 2-year NIH grant for our Streptococcus mutans work funded during my first year. So I had a lot of resources to get going, get my research program up and running. One thing I hope some of the junior faculty listening this morning can relate to is that you quickly realize how difficult it is to achieve that delicate balance between managing several different research projects and also making enough linear progress in one research direction to get those critical initial publications out the door of your lab. So when I first applied for my first large grant application called an R01. This is a multi-year large NIH grant. This was for the primary and as yet unfunded Staph aureus line of our research. One of the criticisms I encountered in the grant reviews is that I had not yet published on this work as an independent investigator. And another challenge at the time is that funding levels for new investigators were historically low. This is just after the recession. And the NIH had a policy at the time that you could only resubmit a grant once, and then you had to go back in with a brand new grant that didn't overlap significantly with the previous grant. So during this time between the first submission and the resubmission, the Emerging Pathogens Institute actually offered small bridge awards you could apply for to address these grant critiques for a resubmission. And so I applied for and received this funding. And this enabled us to develop key protocols, generate extra preliminary data, and acquire key instrumentation for performing the experiments proposed in the resubmission. And unfortunately, at the time, although both the resubmission and the original submission were both scored, but they were not in the fundable range. So this was a major setback and checkpoint for myself, because by this point, the startup funds were almost gone. I was facing a gap in funding for this project. So one thing I had to do is make a priority and refocus my lab's research efforts towards getting this critical publication out the door. This took a team effort, and I had two highly motivated and team player PhD students at the time in my lab. They were able to kind of drop what they were working on and refocus, and as a team, we were able to get this publication out in a timely manner. So the main student working on this project at the time for his dissertation work, he continued to generate new data, even though we were experiencing this gap in funding. He was supported by a teaching assistantship at the time, but what we really needed was some influx of cash to conduct a large and expensive RNA-seq experiment to confirm some of our other experiments we had done, and also to generate new hypotheses in which we could base a new grant. Not long thereafter, Ifas released, I think it was the first year for the Early Career Awards, and the timing couldn't have been better for me. So I applied for this award. I was fortunate to receive one of these first awards, and this allowed us to conduct this initial critical RNA-seq study, and as well as other experiments, which would otherwise not be affordable. And so this data set was the subject of a second publication from our group, and it generated key hypotheses that were the basis basically for a new R01 grant submission. And around the same time, we also received some pilot funding from the Southeast Center for Integrated Metabolomics. And this is a program that still runs currently. They basically give you pilot money to do new metabolomics-based projects. And we were able to get this money, and this combined with the RNA-seq work were both perceived by the reviewers of the new R01 submission as strengths. They actually said that in the critiques, and we were lucky to get this funded on its resubmission this time around. So that was sort of the journey and how the internal funding helped me get that first big grant. I just like to wrap up what I'm discussing this morning by talking about the lessons I learned on this journey. If I could go back in my DeLorean and tell myself advice in the past, this is what I focus on. So again, fully leverage, this is the theme of this morning's session. The internal funding opportunities here at UF, they're critical for bridging gaps in funding, for generating new projects, for getting those grants. So building your unfunded research program to a point where it's ready for external funding. And I didn't see the reviews, they didn't release the reviews of the Early Career Award applications, so I can't really tell you for sure what factors put it in the funded category, but I can tell you a little bit about my strategy in applying for the award. This was basically to prioritize specific concrete objectives, which would be most important for supporting the premise of my grant application I had planned to do, and things that could also be reasonably accomplished in a one-year time frame. As I hopefully illustrated earlier, and maybe not everyone struggles with this, but you have to make linear research progress and publication a priority early on. I've focused a lot on writing grants, which of course is also very important, but it seems these days that some of the granting agencies and the reviewers want some confidence that you can complete the work, and that's mainly measured by your publication record. So getting those initial publications related to those grants out the door early on is really, really important, I think. And again, related to that, it's really important to keep a few research irons in the fire, because not all projects always pan out, but if you have too many projects going on early on, it kind of can dilute your focus and make it difficult to make that linear progress. And if you're finding you're beating your head against a wall with one external grant agency, try and think outside of the box, talk to your fellow faculty in the department and college and elsewhere, and you may be surprised at the opportunities that may present themselves. So for example, in my field of bacterial pathogenesis, everybody focuses on NIH as their primary source of grants, but there are a lot of other federal agencies and national foundations that support this type of research as well. And in fact, 2 of my current grants are actually from NASA. And this is something I wouldn't have thought of if I hadn't moved to UF, quite honestly, because we have faculty in our department that are heavily funded by NASA and do really interesting research. They're very interested in the response of bacterial pathogens to the spaceflight environment, because that will has implications for astronaut health during long-term missions. And so 2 of my current larger grants in the lab are from NASA to work on these kind of questions. So I'll end it with that. Thanks.
Great, thanks very much, Kelly. So I'd like to go ahead and also share my own perspective as a faculty member. And so, you know, when I arrived at UF after being at Oklahoma State for a few years, much like what I've heard from the other panelists and my other colleagues, you know, there were a lot of challenges associated with creating a new program. And I had stepped into what was basically a different type of department from where I had most of my experience. So I'm trained as an agricultural economist. I had published a little bit in forestry, and certainly enough to convince the School of Forest Resources and Conservation at UF that I could step into what was basically a forest economics type role. But I was at a very traditional ag econ type of program at Oklahoma State, and it was also an environment where we didn't have this type of sort of pipeline model of number of internal funding calls. At Oklahoma State, showed up, was basically given a room and a computer and a very meager startup package, and told go compete for students and go find money, but it didn't really know how to do that. It took a while to get a sense of it. When I got to UF, one of the things that really sort of struck me right away was the sense that there was a lot of fertile ground. And working with my colleagues in the SFRC, I was one of 2 economists, which was a little bit different for me. And there were just a lot of really interesting ideas, interesting hallway conversations. And for me, I think the internal funding opportunities were a way for me to really get my training wheels on in terms of writing proposals and later managing projects. And I would say, as Kelly sort of mentioned that DeLorean moment, thinking what I would have done differently. And I think at Oklahoma State, there were definitely some things I would have done differently. At UF, I think the internal funding program sort of focused me in a direction that I really needed to be focused on, which was to develop the specific lines of inquiry for my research program, and to actually get some experience managing people, managing small projects initially, and then ultimately seeing those projects through to fruition. But when I showed up in Gainesville for the first time after being out in Oklahoma, I had a brand new baby. I had walked into the classroom just a few weeks after showing up, and it was difficult to know what to do. And the first internal funding program that benefited me was actually the Ifas Summer Research Internship Program, and it was a very small grant, I think something like $3,000 or $4,000. But it put somebody in my lab, and it gave me some experience managing. It was an undergrad, but still managing somebody. And I actually learned a lot about the way I work, and some of the sort of blind spots that I have in terms of trying to manage people. And so that was actually really helpful, and it was also very small stakes. So it was okay to make mistakes at that scale. For me, the next internal funding program that I was able to get access to was actually the Research Opportunity Seed Fund, which is something that's provided by the Vice President for Research Office. And so this Research Opportunity Seed Fund, gave me an opportunity to work with a couple of colleagues of mine, a forest entomologist and a forest pathologist, so Yuri Holzer and Jason Smith in the SFRC. And not only did we sharpen this concept of basically taking a proactive approach, trying to assess the landscape, looking for, in this case, it was exotic wood borers that would attack would attack commercial pine species, and using a pre-invasion risk assessment. And there was some policy analysis. I mean, all the stuff that I really like to do. We were able to do that at a small scale, and that led to two really interesting outcomes. One of the outcomes is that we were actually able to pull together an interesting group of folks that wanted to work in Cuba. And I had never worked in Cuba before, but Cuba is a very close neighbor of ours, and they have a close cousin of the slash pine, which is one of our primary commercial pine species here in Florida. And the idea was that we were going to look at the risk of a bark beetle, wood boring beetle coming over from Cuba, because we've seen the same sort of issue with potentially citrus-related diseases and screwworm and other pests may have been introduced from Cuba. So we wanted to model that and also get a sense of Cuba's ability to identify plant pest problems and engage on that. But Cuba is a very complicated place to work. It takes a lot of time to get permission to work there, and this internal funding award that we got in 2014 ultimately ended up leading to not one but two awards from USDA Ifas to do field research in Cuba, which, as far as we can tell, was the first time that the U.S. federal government has funded field research in Cuba since the Kennedy administration, which is really interesting. So we were kind of blazing a trail in a sense, about $500,000 to do that work. It also sharpened this concept and pulled this team together, which later led to the creation of this group that we were sort of informally calling the Emerging Threats to Forest Research Group. So this was me and Jason Smith and Yuri Hulser, mostly Yuri. But that put us in a pretty good position to be ready to make a strong proposal when the cluster hires announcement came out. And ultimately we were able to, with the help of some other faculty, John Davis and others, we were able to get one of those funded in the forest health area. And so we've got 3 new faculty focused on forest health plus a staff member, and that morphed into this regional effort called ProForest, Proactive Approaches to Forest Health and Resilience, which is just a really interesting research and extension related group. And so I've got a couple of other examples that I could give. I had an early career seed grant that I got in 2015 that a couple of years later, and with a lot of help from a lot of other collaborators, we were able to morph into a coordinated agriculture project from USDA Rfa. That's a 5-year, $5 million project, which basically started from an initial idea that we had and a $50,000 contribution from Ifas to start to tease out some of these interesting concepts. And so, I personally have benefited, I think, quite a bit. And I've seen my colleagues benefit quite a bit as well from these research, opportunities that come from the internal funding programs. And so I wanted to as part of the panel, be able to tell that story as a faculty member. Now, if everyone will indulge me for just a minute, let me also tell the story, I think, from the perspective of Ifas administration in terms of my time in the research office. And so if I can, let me try to share my screen. And what we should see, if this works, can never quite tell. But if this works, what you should see now is a handout that we've recently developed. This, John Davis in the office developed this, and it was a way for us to communicate to Dr. Engel, to Scott Engel, our new vice president for Ifas, about sort of the approach that we take, this very intentional approach that we use to developing faculty. And this is just meant to be sort of a broad guide here. We do have these dotted lines, hire, tenure, promotion, and promotion. Those are meant to just give a sense that as faculty are progressing through the development of their research program, there are these different funding opportunities. But you could just about put the specific programs anywhere, with the exception of the early career seed grants, which are really only for assistant professors. But as you can see, there's this sort of idea that at a lot of universities, you arrive and you have your startup package. And sometimes they're relatively meager, sometimes they're not. But essentially you're sort of told, good luck. We wish you well. See you at tenure. I'm sure great things are going to happen. And that I think works pretty well if you come in with a lot of experience, maybe as a postdoc, working in some very dynamic labs. Not everybody's got those types of experiences, and as Kelly mentioned, sometimes and also Brett, there can be these sort of gaps. When your startup starts to dwindle, you realize that there are some critical elements that you still haven't delivered on that you need to sort of round out that research program so you can start to hit the bigger extramural funding pots. And so the approach that Ifas takes is to provide these competitive opportunities sort of along the way. And as the startup is dwindling, you've got early career seed grants, you've got the summer research internship programs. I've never gotten one, but others have benefited from the equipment and infrastructure awards. As an economist, instrumentation has just not been a big issue for me. The Target Awards, Travel Awards for Research Grant Enhancement, the Ordway Swisher Jumpstart Program, and others. So I've benefited from many of these, but what I would say I've primarily benefited from is the opportunity to have focused conversations with my colleagues around developing an idea, which ultimately leads to developing a proposal, which gets some internal review, gives you an opportunity to have something that's on the shelf, whether it gets funded or not. Brett had mentioned a short while ago, having quite a bit of success, taking essentially $100,000 of support from Ifas, turning that into $1.2 million of extramural funding, but also having about $13 million in applications. And if my experience has been, if you keep chipping away at the problem, eventually you'll hit on some level. And for me, that's very much been the case. And so I've found this to be a very useful system to come into, and I feel like it has helped really improve my program. But it wasn't until I had a little bit of experience in the Ifas Dean for Research office that I got a sense of this sort of being an intentional approach, and that it was a different approach than the experience that I had at Oklahoma State University, and probably different from what many other universities would tend to use. So I just wanted to share that with everybody to kind of give you a sense of kind of what the landscape looks like. And if you were to be successful enough with these internal funding programs, really it's an opportunity to take that initial startup and really boost that and give you kind of a much bigger sort of bolus of support at key points along the way, and put you in a position to really be successful. So I wanted to just show that briefly. So let me back out of that. And at this point, what I was hoping to do was pivot over to Q&A, and I don't yet see any Q or well, here we go. I think I see one. Actually, you know what? Let me ask one question first, because it came in through the chat. It's the question of how the internal funding awards affect your confidence as a researcher. I was wondering if the panel could speak to that.
Confidence in our ability to get funds?
Sure.
I mean, you understand. I mean, I understood that it wasn't as competitive as a federal environment. So for me, I didn't really affect my confidence at all as far as ability to get federal funds, because I knew it wasn't the same playing field, really.
Yeah, I'd say the opposite for me. For that one project I was focusing on during my discussion, I had almost not given up on it, but it was just very frustrating beating my head against the wall over and over. So that came at a good time, both for the need for the money and also a little confidence boost on that particular project, which did eventually get funded. So yeah.
And I would just add, I mean, if with the funding, if you're able to, one, get a proposal in hand, I mean, there's nothing worse than a blank page. And so, you know, I was able to take the early career proposal and already have kind of like, this was like when NSF DAV was still in the short proposal form. I already had the proposal written, right? So it was very easy for me to then kind of sit down and start turning that over and getting it into the review pipeline, you know, in NSF. But also I was able to use it to kind of develop a publishing record on these topics, which never hurts. And so, I mean, from a confidence perspective, it's just, you feel so much better when you have a few papers that you can reference with your name at the front of it or at the end of it. So I found that to be very valuable.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I think we've heard a few really interesting insights. So the confidence boost, I'll say personally, from my own perspective, it did feel like it really boosted my confidence and you know, helped me to feel like I could go out and, you know, potentially strike gold with extramural funding sources, even the ones that are very competitive, because I had the experience with it. And as Brett mentioned, nothing's worse than a blank page. And once you've got something down, you know, then it's relatively easy to shop that around to collaborators. And at that point, you know, I think it's easier to get over the hump. At least that's been my own experience. I do want to mention just quickly. So there was an analysis that we did in the Dean for Research office looking at the, I guess we can call it return on investment, although that's not quite right. But it does seem like, so, you know, Brett had mentioned the high hit rate, or I guess it was Jonathan, but, you know, a lot of these programs do have, you know, the internal funding programs about a 40 to 50% success rate in terms of the funding for faculty that propose. And what's interesting when we look at this is that the majority of faculty do go on to actually get extramural funding once they've been awarded internally. And so the return on investment seems to be about $4.50 to about $6 per dollar invested, at least over a relatively short window after that initial funding. If we look farther out, it's probably much higher. But there does seem to be about a $40,000 sort of intercept, and so there is something associated with needing to have. It's got to be a big enough chunk of money to make a difference, maybe to help fund a postdoc, you know, to fill some of those gaps. If the money's too small, it doesn't seem like it really leads to extramural funding. And so I just wanted to point that out. So a couple other things I've heard. I love the idea of the DeLorean moment and what would you do if you could go back and talk to your younger self. That's great. I've heard from everybody basically this idea that science is risky, and to be successful, you need to have momentum, you need proof of concept, preliminary data, a number of things, maybe confidence as well. But especially if you're trying to publish in a new area, it's hard to do that if you want to pivot or if you want to grow your program in a different direction. It's hard to do that without having the research funds available to, you know, sort of get a toehold. And you know, aside from that, you know, one thing we haven't really talked about maybe too much, although I think we hinted at it sort of around the margins, is this idea of sort of improving your grant writing abilities and just the practice that you get, and you know, occasionally sort of good feedback that you get from the internal review panels, which I think can be really helpful to sort of identify places where you need to improve. So there was one question that came in just a couple of minutes ago. So Brett mentioned the flexibility of using seed funds to explore new areas of research. Are there any comments on how one balances the quote unquote new aspects in an application for seed funds so that it won't be considered too new or negatively affect the review process? So how do you pivot, but not pivot so much that it looks like you're sort of out of your depth, I guess?
So,
yeah, go ahead, Kelly.
No, I was just going to say, my impression from the many grant reviews that have not been funded, and I don't know what the internal benchmarks are for I haven't sat on the panel before for the Ifas Early Career Award or this UF Opportunity Fund, but I think my instinct is telling me that you need to demonstrate an ability to branch out into that new field. So even if you don't have 10 publication track record on that particular topic, as long as, you know, in terms of techniques, in terms of premise, I think you have to just demonstrate on your own or with the recruitment of collaborators that can help you fill in those deficiencies to go into a new field. And if you have too much expertise, I think that probably wouldn't make you as competitive for those internal funds because the whole point is to get you to branch out into something new.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Kelly. Brett, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I think Kelly kind of made a point that I was trying to make. I just think, well, I guess that, I think there's always the word new is always, there's a delicate balance because at least with my experience so far, it seems like they want new research, you know, there's always, you want new research, but yet really what they want is a story that's already kind of told, right? So it's like, yeah, this is novel work, but it's already, you know, it's pretty much like already done because, you know, the comments are always, well, how about this gap and how about that gap? And actually the Early Career Award, I used almost entirely to fill those gaps. I mean, like, so I can like trace the evolution of this one research proposal that is an absolute thorn in my rear end. And it's like, I hit a wall here in the review, and then I got some small amount of money to address that. And then I submit it again and I got, oh, well, you didn't do this. And I get a little bit and then I do that. And by the time I submit this thing and gets funding, it's like, I've already done A to Z and they're funding A to Z that's already done. It has to be that. I don't, you know, so I think there's like no, like, there's no, like, it's just like a balance of new and old. And I have no idea what that balance is yet. I don't know if anyone really knows it. It just depends on who's reviewing your work, I guess. That's all it comes down to.
So for my 2 applications for internal awards, the areas I was going into were completely new to me. I had no background in them, and I had no publication or preliminary data. I think that there's a extreme emphasis placed on the value of the potential capabilities and research area you're proposing to develop, in addition to, of course, the quality of your proposal. So I think if you're generating a proposal that is high quality and illustrates that there will be value at the end of the road, that the newness isn't a detriment at all, or at least it wasn't in my personal experience.
Great, thanks everybody. So yeah, I just wanted to emphasize. So I've served on a couple of these internal review panels, and having some preliminary data, having some ability to demonstrate that you're already working with the group does help. But I think as you can hear, it's not necessary, at least in terms of the internal funding programs. But you know, as Brett mentioned, being able to tell the reviewer, here's the story, but here's the next chapter in the story, if the funding is provided, is pretty important at probably just about any level. But there's, yeah. Huge.
Sorry, so my comments there were very specific to like outside of UF review process. So I was more saying I was able to use UF support to fill in these gaps that I was receiving from federal agencies. But so one important thing is, like, I had never even thought about doing work on mosquitoes. No track record at all. I mean, I had experience in ecophysiology, but like the proposal that I put in for the Ordway Swisher was entirely new. And so that helped catalyze an entirely new direction for me in my work.
All right. So let me just close by saying, thank you very much to the panelists and to everybody who asked questions. I'd also like to just remind everybody that many of these internal funding programs, they repeat, and so roughly the same time every year or every 2 years, depending, you can expect to see these same calls. You can check on the Ifas Dean for Research website to see what programs are currently active. And we're pretty good about reaching out by email as we have new funding opportunities. So definitely watch out for those. And with that, I just want to thank the panel, and let's move us into the break. And I think the next session is going to be starting here at about 10 a.m. So thank you, everybody. Thanks, Jonathan, Brett, and Kelly. Appreciate it.
All right, everyone, it's 10 o'clock, so we'll get started on our third session of the morning on federal funding. I want to thank everyone for coming today, the participants, and then especially the panelists that we have today. This is a timely topic. We just had a presentation a few weeks ago from VP Angle on NEFA and tips for collaborating with NEFA, which I thought was very useful, and how what we do in Ifas in terms of increasing yields and decreasing inputs into agriculture is right up our alley and what they're really going to focus on in the future. So I thought that tied together with what we want to discuss today very well. I'll share one thing with you is that during the COVID time between March and August, I wanted to check on the amount of federal grants and other grants that our faculty were submitting. So last year in 2019, we had 650 grants submitted. In 2020, there were 651, so virtually identical. However, the amount of funding applied for went from 175 million to 338 million between last year and this year. So our faculty almost doubled the amount of grants they're applying for. So that's excellent news and bodes well for our future. We have a distinguished panel here today to share their observations on different aspects of being successful on grants, especially federal grants. What we're going to do is give each of them about 5 minutes or so to give some beginning observations, and we'll have questions afterwards. And please feel free to enter your questions into the Q&A at any time during this process. So we'll begin with Dr. Yu Wang. Dr. Wang is an assistant professor in food science at the Citrus Research and Education Center in Lake Alfred. Her research focuses on food chemistry and quality. She's a winner of a Richard L. Jones Outstanding New Faculty Award and has a great success in NEFA and SCRI grants. So Dr. Wang, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dean Gilbert. So I'm very glad to be here, and I hope I could help, but I must say I'm still in the process of learning, and my rejection rate is way higher than my successful rate. So, but I do have some experience. I think I could share, from the previous heartbreaking rejections. So, the first thing I learned is, if it's possible, send your proposal to the experienced faculty before you submit, and let them to check it and read it. I know everybody is busy, but just like do that earlier. If you ask earlier, I never have experienced somebody say no to me. They all very helpful. Also, like if you have a collaborator or co-PI in your proposal, they are like senior faculty or experienced faculty. So just like ask them directly to check your proposal carefully and give you more detailed comments. I learned a lot from this process. And second, what I learned is if it's possible, serve on a review panel. This could give you a different perspective, particularly you can see the process from the other side of the table. So I think for assistant professor like me, at the very beginning, it's really hard to get this opportunity, particularly like my first or second year. But the third year, I had this chance. I got this target program provided by Ifas. So I had a chance to visit those program managers. So I learned some tips from them to like serve as a review panel. The first thing they taught me is you can, if you're a junior scientist, so you probably can start from like some smaller program. For example, the one I started with is a small business, the SBRI. So for that program, the proposal is shorter and it's more applied science. So they prefer to see junior faculty or scientists be there. So that's where I started. Another thing is like I emailed them and sometimes they didn't reply. So they said, okay, just keep emailing them and follow up because they have a special time to organize the review panel. So sometimes maybe you email too early and they will let you know That's like what I learned for the review panel thing. Speaking of NIFA or the foundational program or as CRI, what I learned like for foundational program NIFA, I think the preliminary study, the preliminary data is very important. They expect to see a solid data to support your concept, and they want to see the data support the feasibility. So that's like what I learned. For example, like the first year I tried and it's a huge failure. So I got funded the third year after, I almost complete the study. So, for the SCRI, well, that's a multi-state grant. It was really overwhelming to me as a assistant professor. I started to write the SCRI as a PI at the third year. So I had been like collaborating with other faculties the first and second year, but still like when I started as a PI, it was still like very overwhelming. That's a very big grant. So if you're interested in that, I suggest you like start earlier. So that's what I learned. Okay, so this is pretty much like what I want to say here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. And I think your approach of being polite and persistent is probably a good approach for many different things in life, not just on review panels. So thank you for all that information. Our next panelist today is Dr. Freddie Altpeter. He's a professor of agronomy in molecular genetics and biotechnology. His research focuses on genome editing and transgenic approaches for plant improvement. He's been a UFRF professor, very successful at NSF, DOE, and USAID funding. And Dr. Altpeter, the floor is yours.
Dr. Gilbert, thank you very much for the nice introduction. My career total in grants is 147 million, with 15.6 million directly to my program. Most of the funding, as you mentioned, were from federal agencies, including NSF, NIFA, USAID, and DOE. Looking back, getting the first grant was the most challenging. I only had $2,000 of my startup package left when I got the first grant. So what makes getting this first grant more difficult are typically limitations in preliminary data and networking. In my case, I was not eligible to apply for young investigator early career type of grants that all the federal agencies offer, since the cutoff for eligibility at that time was 5 years after your PhD. And I had done a postdoc and group leader position before becoming faculty member at UF. So for those of you who are in the same situation, NIFA still maintains 5 years after the PhD as eligibility criterion for the early career grants. But fortunately, several other funding agencies have modified the eligibility criterion for early career grants. For example, DOE to 10 years after your PhD and NSF to just being non-tenured in a tenure track position. While these early career grants typically do not require multi-institutional and multi-investigator proposals, the vast majority of the federal funding opportunities requires those multi-investigator approaches. This emphasizes on the importance of networking to build a winning team. Typically, you start with your previous professional connections, attending and presenting at professional meetings. But what really makes a difference in expanding your network is when you get involved in your professional societies by working on committees and organizing part or an entire conference. This also offers you an insight how responsive and reliable your colleagues are, and helps you to identify those you want to collaborate with. Typically, you may think about the grant proposal process as thinking of a good idea, carefully reading the RFP and tweaking your idea so that it fits to the program priorities. But have you ever thought about shaping the RFP so that your grant idea is at its core? Well, some of the funding agencies, like for example DOE, have workshops where they solicit input to shape new RFPs So attending such workshops and providing you input may increase your chance of success and may help you to identify additional collaborators during the workshop. This requires early involvement since these workshops are typically taking place a year before the award is made. As an alternative approach to shape the RFP, I have, for example, obtained funding from NSF to organize a workshop with the 30 leaders of my research field, and then generated a review article pointing out the research gaps and submitted a detailed report to NSF, which then helped to shape the new RFP in basically our favor, because the ideas that we identified were at the core of the RFP. If this sounds like too much work for you, good ways to network and get an overview of the research trends are by working on a grant review panel, as pointed out by you already, and the target program may be a very good step to get involved in this. Often you get invited to a panel based on your previous success, but talking to the program director at a conference and offering your service on a grant panel may also be an approach to consider. The main challenge with federal funding is its highly competitiveness, with funding rates typically in the few percent rate. Since you cannot compromise the quality of your proposal, the number of proposals you can submit as main PI is quite limited. Increasing the quantity of proposals can be approached by being co-PI on other proposals, which requires a lot less effort than writing your main proposal, your proposal as main PI, but again emphasizes on the importance of networking and your research outputs so you become a sought-after collaborator. DOE also organizes an annual conference for all funded PIs in the program area, which is a great platform for networking once you have gotten your first DOE grant. And what I particularly like about DOE is the grants are having fairly high ceiling, so you can easily assemble a multi-institutional, multi-investigator team. Often awards range in the $3 million. So for example, one of the most recent grants that came to UF is one from Hadef Santu's team. He assembled a team with the Soil and Water Science Department and Agriculture and Biological Engineering, and they got a grant from DOE at the close to $4 million range for 5 years. That was just announced very recently. USAID, another funding agency I've been working with, has the big advantage that you can support international collaborations. Bola mentioned about his great success in a very large type of grant. Most of the USAID grants are smaller grants, just with one collaborator and a few $100,000 range and country specific. So I, for example, collaborated with Egypt or with Pakistan on some USAID initiatives. So that's what I had for you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Freddie. I appreciate that. And the theme you brought up of networking and then getting to know your collaborators and judging their responsiveness and professionalism, that's come up in other research forums on mentoring for young faculty and how you decide how to build, excuse me, how to build a team. And I think it's important to let faculty know that that's an important thing you can do, but also that you're probably being judged as well when you serve on these committees on your professionalism and responsiveness. So when you start your career, making sure you're off to a good start on those assignments and your communications is very important. So thank you very much for that. Our next panelist is Dr. Pete Hansen. He's a distinguished professor and L.E. Red Larson Professor of Animal Science. His research focuses on understanding determinants of pregnancy success in ruminants. He's had tremendous success in USDA, NIFA, and NIH funding throughout his distinguished career. So Dr. Hansen, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Gilbert. You know, I really love talking about writing grants. I really love getting funded. I really hate writing them. but obviously it's very important. What I want to talk about is the intellectual aspects of grant writing. You know, the number one determinant of a successful grant is just to have a good idea. Grantsmanship is crucial. When you go to grant writing workshops, there's a lot of emphasis on putting together a good grant, and that's crucial, of course, but it won't matter without a good idea. So, I mean, what is a good idea? I guess it's one that has a high probability of being true, that's supported by preliminary data, and most importantly, that captures the imagination of the review panel. A good idea is one where the review panel wants to see the work done. You know, most grants are basically well written. Most grants have preliminary data to support the idea, but it's the ones that are compelling to the review panel that get funded. And unfortunately, what I've noticed serving on review panels is that if your idea is not compelling, it's not interesting, the review panel doesn't tell you that. They tell you they want more preliminary data. They want you to rework Objective 3. They come up with all sorts of technical reasons why the grant's not funded. But it's very rare where they say, like, you know, this is boring. We don't care. We're not going to fund this. It's not high enough priority. So, you know, how do you go about formulating compelling grant ideas that the panel wants to fund, wants to see done? I mean, obviously you got to depend upon your own brilliance as a scientist and your own insight. But, you know, what's compelling is in the eyes of the beholder, in the eyes of your colleagues. So you need to be connected, like Freddie just said. You need to be connected with your discipline intellectually. You know, you need to be active in the world, participate in the kind of things that Freddie was talking about. You need to know what's going on in your science. Go to meetings, talk to people in the hallways, you know, find out what are the intellectual currents that at the moment are the most interesting. And that'll develop into a compelling idea. So, you know, you have to be an engaged scientist, I guess I would say. And another piece of advice I would have is be open to criticism. Expose your ideas to your colleagues and get the advantage of their critical abilities to hone your ideas and make them better. You know, a lot of people don't want to be criticized. And as you get older, you probably tend to like it less. And people are less likely to criticize you. Everybody wants to criticize a grad student. Not that many people criticize full professors to their face. And so sometimes you have an idea that's got some flaws in it, but nobody actually tells you because they don't want to offend you. What you said is very true. Get somebody to read your grant, but get somebody who actually cares enough about you, cares enough about the science, who will criticize it. Most people who read my grants, they correct the English. They don't really address like the fundamental aspects of the grant. You know, find somebody who's a critic and who is interested in you enough to provide you with that criticism. And you don't have to listen to everything they say, but in the long run, you'll be better off. You know, James Watson, the double helix James Watson, he said the way to be successful in science is to surround yourself with people better than you, because you will get lifted up as a result. And I think that's excellent advice. And I've certainly been fortunate in my own career to have scientists that I work with, you know, who are better than me and make me better than I otherwise would be. And then just the last thing I would say, there's a lot of effort that we heard today to get young scientists started on a successful track. But when you meet your mid-career or later career, those resources decline. And sometimes you can find yourself in a bind. You know, your ability to write grants depends upon the preliminary data you have. Well, as science changes, as what's compelling today is not all that exciting tomorrow. sometimes you can find yourself in a situation where your body of work doesn't really prepare you to get the next grant anymore. So I think it's important as you live your life as a scientist, to continue to focus, to continue to reach out to the world, continue to focus on what are the exciting currents in your science, and to try to adapt your focus so that you're always current and not behind. And, a sabbatical, besides opportunity to visit France or whatever, a sabbatical can really be an outstanding opportunity for somebody who finds themselves stuck in the grant getting business. It's a chance to get new ideas, get new preliminary data, work in a lab where a lot of exciting things are going on, and give you the opportunity to start over almost. So those are kind of the pieces of advice I wanted to transmit today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hansen. I really appreciate your remarks. And I think the stereotype in coming up with ideas for professors is that we sit around in our smoking jackets with a sifter of brandy and shout Eureka when something comes into our head. And I think it's a lot more difficult than that, a lot of hard work and keeping connected to the discipline and our colleagues. So thanks for sharing that with us. Dr. Bryony Bonning is our next panelist. She's an eminent scholar and professor of entomology and nematology. Her research focuses on molecular interaction of viruses and insects. She is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and more importantly than that, she's probably served on the most research forum panels of any faculty member, and Ifas, which will get her an award, non-monetary award from us shortly. So Dr. Bonning, thank you so much for your service, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. So what I'm going to talk about for 5 minutes, and I'm going to stop my timer here, is writing for the reviewers. So reviewers are serving on a panel, and it's a huge undertaking in terms of the amount of time and effort to do that. You might have anything from 12 to 30 proposals to look at on a panel. And reviewers are just like you and me. We all have too much to do. And so the perspective that I'd like you to consider is making their lives easier. Have them like your proposal because you made their job easier in addition to the great science, and leave them with the impression that you have really great attention to detail. So in the previous session, there was some discussion about what would you tell your younger self, and what I would have told my younger self on day one is sign up for the grant writers seminars and workshops. They have an excellent formula for how to write a grant proposal to make the reviewer's life easier. And as a result of taking this training when I was an assistant professor, I now really enjoy writing grants, in contrast to Pete's previous comment on that. So this gives you the opportunity to delve in depth into research that has been done, to read, catch up on literature, etc. And so to me, this is fun. So I will add at this point that Ifas has a tentative plan to hold a workshop next year in 2021. But in the meantime, they offer guides, grant writing guides that you can buy directly from their website, which is grantcentral.com. They have guides that are specific to NIH, NSF, and the USDA. They cost $80 or $90. And this really provides an excellent structure for how to logically put a grant proposal together without some of the key pitfalls. So just to give you an idea, one of the most important things is to know exactly what the panel is looking for. How are they going to assess your proposal? And then within your proposal, really emphasize key points related to those criteria. Pick up some key words, even phrases from the RFA. Obviously make sure that they're italicized or something so it's clear that they are quotations. And one of the most important things is the very first page, which the specific aims page in NIH speak, which basically it is one page. It sets the scene, it identifies the knowledge gap, shows what you're going to do what the expected outcomes are, how this fills into that knowledge gap. And the whole process is designed to make your project compelling. So identifying what the problem is, what the need is. The second thing you do after you have spent a good deal of time on that specific aims page, because it is the most important part of the grant, once you have that down, everything else falls into place. But the second thing is the experimental design or the methods section. And by doing it writing it in this order, you then have your methods defined. You go back to your preliminary data and the background information, and it makes sure that you don't put anything into that proposal that is not directly relevant to the work that you're proposing to do. A common mistake is to try to impress the reviewer with the breadth of your knowledge on the subject. That just makes their life more difficult, makes your proposal more difficult to read. So the other thing is the attention to detail. Ensure that your proposal is absolutely tight. The methods should match the budget. Specific equipment items or facilities that you plan to use should be detailed in the supporting information. USDA, for example, has specific forms for these aspects. And avoid using generic facilities and resources forms. It's really obvious if they're describing things that you're not going to use in your proposal. In the budget, for example, if you're going to do transcriptomics, you need to specify in the budget justification the cost, the number of test controls you're going to do, the number of replicates. Actually show the reviewers the math and have it tie in with your methods. So this attention to detail is really important. Another aspect is use letters of collaboration, provide drafts to emphasize key points that you want to share with the reviewer. So I will reiterate that serving on a panel is the best way to see the reviewer perspective, but also a couple of things. Be organized, use the tools available to you. In particular, every semester needs a plan offered through the National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity. Don't be overwhelmed. And on a personal note, I have been doing this job for 25 years. I have submitted about 7 proposals a year. Now that includes everything from internal grants to center grants. My success rate is about 33%. So you can do the math to see how many proposals I have submitted. There is a TED talk called Grit about persistence. And when I saw that not too long ago, that really struck a chord with me. And particularly junior faculty, if you are feeling like really stressed, that is a good one to take a look at. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bonning. I appreciate that. And grit and persistence, I think, are another good life lessons to learn, not just your professional, but also personal life these days. And I also appreciate you mentioning the grantsmanship workshop, which we're planning on having next year. And we also do consultancies as well with that company for teams that get together. And they can have more targeted sessions with the company they're chosen for those consultancies. So that's another opportunity for our faculty as well. I'd like to welcome our final panelist here for their introductory remarks, Dr. Will Patterson. He's a professor in marine fisheries ecology in the School of Forest Resources and Conservation. His research is primarily on population dynamics and structure of populations in marine fishes. He's had extensive and sustained NOAA grant success. And Dr. Patterson, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Dean Gilbert. And thank you folks for attending today. So, you know, obviously my research, my program is a little different than many of the speakers we've heard even within the session, in that I'm on the natural resources side of the house. And as Dean Gilbert mentioned, most of the funding I've had through time has come through various programs through the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, including National Marine Fisheries Service, National Ocean Service, Sea Grant, state and federal level. But we've also had funding from EPA, Department of Defense, and NSF. And the thing that I want to talk about here is, we've heard some information, some ideas about how to kind of break through with a large federal award. But in this last segment, we're going to talk about how to sustain that, how to build a program that will sustain your productivity through the long term. And really, I think there are three components to this, and they involve productivity, planning, and then seeking. And by productivity, basically what I just mean here is produce when you're, once you're funded. Be a good steward of the resources that have been entrusted to you. And this involves managing projects effectively. Over a third of every dollar that we bring into UF as researchers, it goes to F&A or indirect. There are many resources available for post-award management of grants, and you should take advantage of those, especially if you're leading a multi-investigator award where you definitely want to be well organized, keep everybody attuned to what's needed when things are due, and keep the process moving smoothly. And to that end, know what the deliverables, what deliverables are expected, and how to produce them. Now, clearly, if you've gotten funding, you've been funded under a given RFP, you have some idea of what deliverables are expected, but different programs and different RFPs have different types of deliverables needed. In my own work, if I apply to Sea Grant, for example, I know that student training or postdoc training is going to be a critical component to what they perceive as a successful award. So you can't just wave your hands at this in the proposal submission process. You actually have to deliver, or your likelihood of getting future funding is going to be diminished. Complete your projects in a timely fashion, right? Stay on top of things, move toward the deliverables, so that you don't have to write for no-cost extensions, especially repeated ones. Publish in a timely manner. Now, faculty, especially assistant professors that are striving for tenure and promotion, understand that publication and a strong publication record is important. Oftentimes, that's not stressed very much to our graduate students who are doing oftentimes are doing a lot of the day-to-day work. In my own laboratory, I have an added expectation or requirement of PhD students in particular that they have to have published at least one chapter of their dissertation before they defend. So this gets the idea in their head that this is part of the expectation, and oftentimes by the time they defend, they've published a big chunk of their dissertation already. So not only does this set your students up for success, but it also gets your own work, from that funding out the door and peer reviewed. Over deliver, don't over promise. I think Brianna's commentary about the critique and review process and what reviewers are looking for, oftentimes this will be snuffed out in that process if people are over promising what can be produced. But oftentimes we have different sources of funding, and we can leverage that funding so that we can actually over deliver on what we said we're going to do in a given grant. And I think that's important. It's clearly important not to over promise and come up short. And lastly, under this productivity aspect, is be a good teammate on multi-investigator projects. So if you're invited as a younger faculty member to be part of a multi-investigator project, appreciate what skills you bring to the table, and participate fully, but be a good teammate. It'll get you invited back later, especially if you're productive and you add quite a bit to the overall product. As far as planning for the future, leverage other funding to expand the scope of the work that you're doing on a given grant. Oftentimes in Ifas, many of us do work that could be categorized as foundational or basic science, as well as really applied types of science. And a given question or area of research for me could go to NSF as a really foundational or fundamental science question, or it could go to NOAA as a really applied question, just depending on how the question is framed and what type of experimental work is being described. So be able to leverage that so you can move in different directions. Many of the awards or RFPs and programs that IFAS faculty apply for have built into them a renewal process. And obviously this is true for NIH type of funding. And so plan ahead for renewal, right? You want to be from day one thinking about what it's going to take, what is it going to take to actually get this renewed and have success long term. In the process of completing a given grant, think about new lines of research that you can develop. Now, we heard in earlier sessions about seed money and seed support that comes through IFAS and your ability to tap into that to develop questions or expand work. But you can do this within funded grants as well, and I think it's really important, especially things that may be more cutting edge or have a greater potential for failure. If you can attach this to work that's already funded, then you can build the seed data, like Pete Hansen was talking about just a minute ago, or Freddie was talking about as well, to go into larger proposals to places like NSF or NIH. that have probably a lower probability of success, but also want to fund things that are that have a higher probability of failure. And then also to diversify. We heard some information about this again in some of the earlier sessions. Diversify your research program. So you can move in different directions. You can respond to the winds of change within federal funding priorities, and you'll have plenty of potential then to keep your lab funded moving into the future. And lastly, what do I mean by seeking, right? Seek and accept invitations to grant panels. As a young investigator, sometimes that's difficult, but I wouldn't let an opportunity go by if you were asked to be a member of a grant panel, regardless of how much other work you have going on. It's critically important to see the types of things that are being submitted, the types of discussions that happen at the panel level, and also what program managers are thinking about and how they steer those discussions. It really, really provides important input to you as a grant writer. Accept invitations to advisory panels. Freddie, again, mentioned some of these may be RFP workshops for a given program, but they don't have to be. In my own field, I serve on scientific committees that advise at the state, at the regional and the national level on fisheries management. Now, I'm not a fisheries manager, but a lot of the work that we do feeds into stock assessments and feeds into fisheries management programs. By participating in these groups, I stay current in the types of questions that may be on the horizon. And lastly, accept editorial positions, right? I mean, you don't want to spend a lot of time with lower profile journals that aren't going to give you much return as far as your service effort here. But serving in editorial positions actually does enable you a closer view on the other side, another aspect of the peer review process. Obviously, peer review of grants is critically important for funding, but seeing how those grant products are then put into play and serving in editorial positions, although it may seem like it's outside of the funding process, it's not. It's the last component of it. And as Pete mentioned earlier about staying current in your field, this is a great way to do that. So seek and accept those when you have the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pattison. I appreciate those remarks. And the comments you made about granting agencies want to fund successful work and you establishing a track record of success by what you're doing with these grants through publishing the work and even submitting the reports on time. I will state that as a dean, we get copied from agencies if they have problems with timeliness of reports. You'll get to spend time with my office, but it won't be quality time that you want to have as a faculty member. So that's a really important message. So thanks to all the panelists for sticking on time. We have lots of time for questions, and I urge the panelists, participants, to go ahead and send things into Q&A. So we'll start with the first one that we received here. It's for you, Juan, but I think I'd like to pose this for everybody. And the question has to do with what would be your comments with regards to how diverse, based on background, a grant team would have to be? Is it the more interdisciplinary, the better? Are you looking for a carbon copy of yourself? Or are you looking for a broad, diverse team going forward for these grants? You and others, what would you have to say to that?
I think actually the team should fit like what you propose. Like for a foundational like NIFA foundational program, that's like you probably only have $500,000, and obviously you couldn't put a very large team, but you have to have the team member with the sufficient experience with the method or the objective you propose. For example, like we have a project, like we're gonna handle metabolomic data and transcriptomic data. Like my lab are doing that. I saw like, okay, we can do some coding thing and we could do, by ourselves to do the data analysis, but actually for the reviewer, they didn't think that's enough. So they want a bioinformatic faculty or collaborator in that proposal. And also like sometimes like for me, like to start at the very beginning, I'm in the chemistry, the natural product chemistry area, but I didn't have enough publication. So I still need someone maybe have the overlapped experience as a collaborator on that proposal. But like for a bigger grant like SCRI, I would say yes. So that's like a multi-state, multi-disciplinary grant. So they want like research extension. So social science, that's like very important.
Thank you. I think the principles you mentioned in terms of making sure the disciplines fit the study are important. And also, a lot of, I'll just add that a lot of these grant opportunities come with outreach components or perhaps social science components, and just slapping that onto the end is pretty obvious to the reviewers. And so making sure they're an integral part of your team from the beginning is important. We had a question come in the chat, and Dr. Patterson, you mentioned post-award resources are available here. And perhaps for you and others on the panel, what are some of those resources that you've used that have been helpful to you in managing your grants?
So in SFRC, we have a couple of different folks that work on the post-award side. And Christy Plow is the staff member who really heads up that component. And she does a great job of reminding us of when things are due. Obviously, the agencies themselves do that, but also our burn rate on funding. How much have you spent? Are you coming up on certain categories being overspent? Have you already utilized the 10% rule in federal grants where you can move funding around without having to ask permission? And so those types of things, she's critically important for tracking that type of information. And it enables the PIs not to have to deal with the minutia on the accounting side and focus on the science products more so than the fiscal responsibilities of the university. I don't actually know in other units how that's handled or how it's handled necessarily in the dean's office, but within SFRC, we do have Christy as a great resource.
Yeah, I think many departments have that post-award person within departments or in the shared service center for those that have the shared service center model. Okay.
If I could follow up on something that Dr. Patterson mentioned about diversifying research areas. This is really important. And if you have different areas that you are interested in, pursue them all. So that has been my strategy. I've got several things I'm very interested in. I go with what gets funded ultimately. And I've also seen people who have been really focused on, for example, a particular biochemical aspect within insects, and that it's just so focused. And if they don't succeed in getting grant funding, then they end up with teaching appointments or something. So diversifying, I just wanted to reiterate how important that is for grant success.
Thank you, Bryony. Let me pose a question. I'll start with Freddie and Pete for this question. How, when, and why should faculty reach out to program managers at granting agencies?
I always reach out to them when I don't get funded. And sometimes they're a wealth of information. Sometimes they tell me nothing. Read your panel summary. I don't know. I mean, in my experience, they haven't been that important ahead of time. I pretty much know which programs are focused on topics that I would be competitive for. I mean, I know some people reach out to them to see if their research fits with this program or that program, but I usually know that. I do reach out to them, I mean, to be honest, just so they know me. And I probably cannot emphasize enough, there is a lot of personal relationships in science, and I think people are more sympathetic to grant writers that they know personally than just a name. So I do try to know the panel managers.
Thanks, Pete. I'll add on to that. That was one of our goals in the Target program, was getting people up to meet those folks in DC and form those relationships. Now with COVID-19, we're gonna have to find a bit of a new model. Maybe we're doing it like this via Zoom instead of having trips to DC for the next year or so. Freddie, I'll let you go ahead.
Yeah, so from my experience, particularly with DOE, there is a mechanism where you always interact with the program manager at least once a year, and that's when we have our PI meeting where all the PIs report, and that gives you a platform to discuss your results directly with the program manager and engage in some conversation. And I agree with Pete, the important thing is just that the program manager is familiar with your work. If you propose something, he can, you know, respect your program and appreciates the kind of work that you're doing. So you knock on open doors. And I typically don't have a lot of questions, but I engage in discussion and trying to find what, you know, new trends are and so on. But usually I don't ask the program manager for advice regarding my submission or for feedback on my submission. I'm just trying to keep a continuous discussion going over the years.
Thank you. And we have some other questions that have come up. One is, I think, are early career grants for just faculty who completed their PhD? Completed my PhD more than 10 years ago, but I'm new faculty here. So I think there are differences. We have internal programs, for example, called early career awards, which assistant professors are eligible for. So it doesn't matter when you got your PhD, as long as you're an assistant professor here, you can apply for those. But then different agencies have different criteria. And Freddie, maybe you were talking about that. You'd like to.
Yeah, so there was a time in the early 2000s where most of the agencies said the cutoff is 5 years after your PhD, but that has changed. So it's worthwhile investigating each and every agency and look at each and every agency's criteria for eligibility. So the NSF Early Career Award, for example, doesn't state anymore any years. They just say you need to be non-tenured in a tenure track position, and you can do it only once, and that's common with most of them. You can only get one early career award. NIFA now has still a 5-year after the PhD eligibility criterion. But what is interesting with NIFA, now they have 2 types of early career. They have an early career seed fund and an early career standard grant. So if you go for the early career standard grant, you're not competing with the rest of the world. You're just competing with other early career investigators, and same for the seed grant. Seed grant is much smaller portion of funding and allows you to just you know, get preliminary data for a standard grant.
Thanks, Freddie. And now we're starting to get a lot of questions coming in. So let's see if I combine. 2 of these have to do with getting on panels. One has, is it a good practice to email program directors about this? And what actions besides meeting people directly would you suggest to do in order to get invited as a reviewer in a NIFA or NSF panel? So maybe successful strategies for getting on panels is the overall question. Would anybody like to comment on that?
I can address that. The best strategy is to identify the appropriate panel manager for the panel to which you will be submitting in the future. Email the program manager, sorry, with a brief description of what your area of expertise is, and just simply indicate that you're willing to serve on the panel. So you'll be on their radar. It is sometimes difficult for them to find panelists, so I think they're usually really grateful when they get these emails.
Okay. And I think you said that you had to do this several times, right? At some point?
Yeah, I did. And yeah, sometimes I emailed them, but they didn't reply. But what they told me is like, you know, send a follow-up email, because sometimes they're just like busy or they're travel, and or sometimes they feel like it's too early. So they can reply you late, but they just totally forgot. So, but I mean, yeah, just send them a follow-up email.
Like Will said, don't ever say no. I had an ex-student who said no one time. You know, don't miss the opportunity no matter how busy you are.
Yeah, especially early on. Later you can say no, but get the experience early on.
We have another question here. I guess, Freddie, this might be for you. Are the DOE PI meetings open to others? My experience with DOE has been that the type of work funded is of a specific nature that has been difficult to sniff out without that inside knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're not open to others. So you have to have your first DOE grant, and that's why it's so critical to go after these early career opportunities. The early career funding for DOE, as I mentioned, has this eligibility criterion of 10 years after your PhD. That is not very exclusive. And so if you get your first grant going, you will be invited to these PI meetings, and I think that's very important to get an idea of what's coming, what's on the horizon, and what collaborations to form. So I really think getting your first DOE grant is the stepping stone.
Okay, all right, thank you. Well, folks, I think we've come to pretty much the end of our time for our panel. I think they all did a wonderful job. Thank you so much. Oh, wait a minute, maybe there's one last Q&A. Oh, no, just a thank you. All right, very good. So everybody, thanks you. Thank you so much for your service on this panel. I think it was very educational. I really appreciate your different perspectives, and thank you for sharing those. So we're gonna have a 10-minute break, and then 11 o'clock, I see John Miller already getting ready for his group at 11 o'clock. So don't sign off, please, because apparently Zoom is having issues today. If you sign off, you won't be able to sign back on again, apparently. All right, thank you, everybody. Take care.
All right, everyone. Well, it's 11 o'clock, and appreciate you joining us here today for our session on commercialization of research outcomes. My name is John Muller. I'm the Executive Director of Florida Foundation Seed Producers, and we have an excellent panel today. We're still waiting on one member of our panel who I think is having some technical difficulties getting in because of Zoom, but we have hope that he will be able to join us here after we get started. So in terms of our panel, it's myself, John Muller, Dr. John Byatt, who's the Associate Director of Tech Licensing at UF Innovate. Dr. Nanyao Su is a distinguished professor in the Department of Entomology and Hematology based at the Fort Lauderdale Research and Education Center. Dr. Su is a world-renowned entomologist and is well known for the global success of the technology that he invented, which was used to create the termite baiting system known as Centricon. Our next faculty member on the panel is Dr. Barry Tillman. Dr. Tillman is a professor in the Department of Agronomy based at the North Florida Research and Education Center in Marianna. Dr. Tillman is a highly productive plant breeder that has developed and released multiple commercial peanut cultivars that have been planted on over hundreds of thousands of acres across the U.S. peanut belt. Our final member of the panel is Dr. Marcio Resende, Assistant Professor in Horticultural Sciences. Dr. Resende is a sweet corn breeder at the University of Florida. Prior to joining the faculty in 2017, Dr. Resende served as the Chief Executive Officer of Rapid Genomics, a startup company spun out of the University of Florida in 2011 based on the DNA genotyping technology developed while Dr. Resende was completing his doctorate at UF in Dr. Matthias Kerr's lab in the School of Forest Resources and Conservation. So to kick us off, Dr. Byatt will begin. I will then have some comments on cultivar release and licensing, and then we'll move into insights shared by the faculty, and we'll have time for question and answers at the end of our talks. Please do submit your questions through the Zoom function throughout the meeting, and we will catalog those and then answer them as a panel towards the end. So without further ado, I will turn it over to John Byatt.
Okay, hey, thank you, John. And hi, everybody. Great to be talking to you about commercialization and tech licensing. So is it Cassie or John? Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. Perhaps since the last time talked about tech licensing, we got one slight change. So we've rebranded under UF Innovate, and under UF Innovate, we have tech licensing, or the old Office of Technology Licensing. But under that umbrella, we also got the Innovation Hub, which I'm located in right now, the Sid Martin Biotech Center up in Alachua, and a couple of new things. Ventures, which is a venture fund, which University of Florida Research Foundation has money invested in that, and that's to invest into new companies which are spun out of technology developed at UF, as well as corporate engagement, which I'm going to mention a little bit towards the end. So next slide, please. And the idea is that we have a overall comprehensive commercialization ecosystem. And a part of that, of course, is IP that we deal with here in tech licensing. But in the event that we have startups, we have the facilities, if necessary, to help incubate those companies, as well as some money to invest in them, a entrepreneur in residence network, and then ways to reach out and work more directly with our corporate partners. So next slide, please. So here I want to say, the function of tech licensing is to get promising new technology, new ideas into the hands of industry partners. The idea is that we want to help you develop new products, new services from the ideas, concepts, innovations, inventions that come out of your research. And the idea is we want those to be developed into products or services, which are going to help our stakeholders and be for the public good. And the overall emphasis is not how much money we're going to make on those. So, we develop all sorts of things which are not necessarily huge money makers. I mean, it's great if it's $1 million idea, but we're interested in any innovation that one way or another we can help get that developed so that it helps people. And it's the amount of money that's going to be generated is not really a deciding factor. Of course, we don't want to spend $1 million in order to get something to market and underwrite that for private enterprise. But we look at that and say, if we're involved, can we help get this product or service developed? And so, we're basically saying, if you've got an idea, talk to us. The next slide, please. It starts with a conversation. And we have an invention disclosure site, which is on the next slide. We'll go to that in a moment. But if you have an idea and you think this might be useful, this could be the basis for a company, this could be the basis for a new product. Perhaps it's it could be a new service. My ask of everybody on the line today is, if you have an idea and you're not quite sure if this might be a good idea, so-so idea, it could be something we want to invest in, give me a call, send me an email. It starts with a conversation, but these days, it's sometimes harder to connect with people. And part of our job here is outreach and to talk to the departments and our investigators, particularly new investigators. That's become a little bit more challenging this past year until we can meet in person. So my request to everybody is, you got something that might be interesting, shoot me an email or give me a call and let's talk about it. Because we need to talk about these ideas oftentimes before there's publication. So for the next slide, please. We have a website and you can go there and it's an electronic disclosure form. We don't ask that many questions. The basics are, who all was involved? So who are the people that are involved with this innovation? What was the funding? So if it's federally funded, we have an obligation to the granting agency to report that disclosure. Or if it's funded through a research agreement, we might have obligations to the sponsor. But for the most part, we try to make this as simple as possible, with as few questions as possible. But one thing to note here is that this invention disclosure, when you disclose that, is not the same as a patent filing. So go to the next slide, please. So the process here is, at some point you have an idea, and we're going to ask for a written disclosure, the invention disclosure form. Regardless of whether I've already spoken to you, we may skip this, but at some point I'm going to want to talk to the inventors and find out more about this idea. So get some more details as to the invention, who you've talked to, what your publication plans are. And we then have a period of time, 120 days, to look at, well, if it's an invention that might be patentable, do a prior art search and see, is this patentable? Is it novel? Is it non-obvious? Does it have utility? And during this time, make a decision as to whether to exert UF's rights to the invention or wave it back to you, the inventor. If we exert rights, then we look for licensees or a commercial partner and make decisions about patenting and patent prosecution. And hopefully at the end of this, we find a commercial partner we can license rights to and that will work with us to develop a technology that is useful in the marketplace. I can go to the next slide, please. So I want to say just a few words about patents. So patents are a means to an end. We patent things not because we can, but because we're hoping to create a business tool that has some value to potential licensee. And those patent rights provide whoever controls them, whoever we license them to, the ability to prevent others from using that invention, which can be useful. And it oftentimes is necessary in order for a company to invest a lot of money in further developing those patent rights. So I put some emphasis on this because in order for us to get patent rights, the idea has to be novel. And that novelty means it's not already in the public domain. So we have to file a patent application before you've published anything, before you've been to a meeting and have a poster presentation, but particularly before that material is published in a journal, even online. And so communication is key to this whole system working. We need to see the disclosure and decide whether or not to file something before you publish and before there's for instance, a meeting, a conference, and a oral presentation or a poster presentation. Now, I'm never going to say to you, nobody in this office is ever going to say don't publish. Nobody's ever going to say delay publication. We understand publication is key to tenure and promotion and getting grants. So what we do is secondary to the primary mission of this university. But if you think it might be useful and that we might be able to develop some product or service based on that technology, give me a call, send me an email before you submit that manuscript for publication, and let's talk about it. And if there is something there that we might want to protect, we can do it very quickly. That's not the ideal. Ideally, we'd like to have a couple of months for the patent attorneys to put together a well thought out and strategic patent application. But if you forget, or if this is something that comes up the last minute, we can have what's called a cover sheet provisional filed. But in either case, it's important, if there really is something there that we can build on, for us to file before that publication. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to say just a couple of words about corporate engagement. So there are many other universities that have tried to coordinate outreach to industry. And we are coming late to this game, but we have somebody in that position right now. We have another position which is we're hiring to fill that. But corporate engagement is more than just sponsored research. It's more than just gifts to the university from various industry. It's more than just having some of our graduate students and undergraduates go and work for companies, it's taking a more holistic approach to this and saying, okay, how do we work with UFF? How do we work with the folks that already have connections with industry, and try to put together a program where we are reaching out to some of the people we've worked with in the past, some of the corporate partners we worked in the past, and say, okay, can we expand this relationship? And it's part of our overall strategy to, one, get to $1 billion worth of research funding, but also, particularly with Ifas, where many of you have much closer relationship with our stakeholders and with industry than people who do purely basic research. And it's a way to try to stimulate a closer relationship with industry that will pay off in the long run, rather than just these one-offs. So I'm not going to, last slide please. I'm not going to say an awful lot about this, but it pulls together not only licensing, sponsored research, philanthropy, opportunities for our students and graduate students. It rolls all those things together so that in the end, we are going to have a much closer alignment with industry. And so I'm just throwing this out there that if you do have connections with industry, we'd love to hear about it, because it's something that potentially we can build on in the long run. So, John, I have probably come to the end of my 15 minutes, and I see, do you want to answer questions now or wait to the end?
Let's wait till the end, John. I think we should have a good amount of time at the end, and it also allow us time to collate some questions over the time period here. So thank you very much for your perspective and comments there. I think certainly looking at the corporate engagement role, I think there's a lot of opportunity for synchronization throughout the university in regards to corporate engagement. So thank you. All right, shifting, I'll give a brief presentation just on the UF Ifas cultivar release process and licensing, particularly as it pertains to new plant varieties developed by faculty plant breeders. When you look at breeding faculty across Ifas, there's 27 faculty breeders and collaborating geneticists across 3 academic departments and 1 school. Many of the plant breeding faculty within Ifas are based at research and education centers across the state, working with the crops in the particular geographic region, generally where those industries are located. As many of you know, diversity is the name of the game in terms of Florida agriculture. And so the breeding faculty are working to improve 50 different plant species today, and tomorrow it's probably even more. And a very productive group in development of cultivars released, 255 over the past 10 years. In terms of the cultivar release process, it really begins when a breeder or developer makes a recommendation to their department chair that a potential cultivar or germplasm line should be considered for release. The department chair then convenes what's called a cultivar release advisory committee that provides the review and consideration of the proposed release. Generally speaking, a new cultivar should have the potential to make a significant contribution to Florida agriculture and or the general public. And generally the breeding programs are organized in such a fashion that these breeding targets are very specific from the beginning. So working to improve yield, increase disease resistance, extend market windows, so earlier ripening or later maturing traits, and using that to develop something new or novel. Another consideration is whether advantages of the proposed release outweigh the disadvantage, especially when comparing the new release to existing cultivars or existing standards within the industry. And ultimately, are stakeholders likely to use the new cultivar? What is the potential impact and potential that this new variety would have? The advisory committee really provides a scientific scrutiny, so evaluating the data, the years, locations, number of replications to confirm the performance or claims of improved traits. So if, for example, if disease resistance is the basis on which a new variety is developed, does the data support, has it been screened in an environment that would be conducive to that disease to really fully evaluate its performance? Another key consideration is potential for invasiveness. Several plant breeders within Ifas are working to sterilize or make invasive plants non-invasive. And so certainly in consideration of those, it's evaluating the sterility of those proposed releases. Additional considerations at this phase also are intellectual property, protection options, the potential licensing considerations that would impact utilization or adoption of a new variety, and also reviewing draft manuscripts. The advisory committee then makes a recommendation to the cultivar release committee, which has final approval on release of new varieties. John Byatt had mentioned the importance of communication. It all starts with a conversation. I think I would echo that certainly in terms of cultivar development. Generally, new varieties are years in the making. It's, as I mentioned, there's breeding targets that are set out early on, and populations are developed and then screened and whittled down to identify new varieties or new lines that have improved performance. And so I think it's natural in this process that there's time for communication. I would say certainly in terms of plant breeding, there's probably less or fewer eureka moments where you just happen to be doing something and come across something novel or new. Oftentimes, development of something novel and new is expected in plant breeding. And so I think early and frequent communication with our office is very important, certainly as we anticipate future release of new varieties. Another key consideration, I think, there has been times where a new faculty member will have worked for several years in developing something new. And they may say, this has excellent disease resistance in the greenhouse. But it hasn't, the next step hasn't been taken to confirm that resistance in the field. And so generally, I think many of the cultivar release policy requirements are easily obtained or met through the stages of breeding. And so I think understanding what will be required through the cultivar release process very early on is helpful, so that you don't reach what you think is the end and then realize that you need to go back and work on a season or two of horticultural or agronomic performance data. In terms of IP for plant varieties, protection methods or plant patents, PVP protection certificates, utility patents, and plant breeders' rights. The diverse portfolio of breeding programs within Ifas requires a specialized approach, and oftentimes protection options are determined by the particular crop. The majority of varieties released by Ifas are non-exclusively licensed, so they're licensed to multiple nurseries or multiple seed companies, which then will propagate or increase seed and sell seed or plants of these varieties to growers and stakeholders. When we do pursue exclusive licensing, we use an invitation to negotiate or ITN process that allows for all interested parties to submit proposals to be considered for an exclusive licensing opportunity. What's very unique in terms of cultivar releases in the royalty distribution policy for new plant varieties at the University of Florida is 70% of royalties are returned to the plant breeding program that developed the cultivar. And this has been really impactful in sustaining and growing plant breeding research programs at the University of Florida. So there is a lot of opportunity for continued research program support given the cultivar intellectual property policy. That concludes my brief overview in terms of cultivar release and licensing. So we'll now pivot and move to, excuse me, some faculty insights. And Dr. Sue will ask you to offer your comments and perspectives. I think you're muted, Dr. Sue.
Oh, sorry.
Perfect.
Okay. Okay. So let me start again. When I at the beginning of in the process try to think about what is patentable, and before I even submit the disclosure to John Byatt's office, the first thing I do usually is to search for prior art, because that is really examiner is looking for. Your patent don't have to work very well, only to demonstrate its work. But examiner always try to find something previously exists, try to knock you off. That's their job. Their job is to say prior art exists or not. So that's really important. So today, if you have internet access, you can search from a couple of engines. You can cover quite a large territory of prior art, something similar to your own idea of some patent. And when I was reading through those things, usually what impressed me is that vast majority of those patents I'm reading have never been commercialized. It's just never been used. And I think that picture is probably very similar even within the UF, our patent portfolio. I will venture out to say that majority of the patent granted for UF faculty are probably nothing but a nice wall decoration. Placed in a frame, put it on the wall and say, nice, I have a patent. Does it generate much money? Probably not. And so you have to think about why. Why these patents never generate a penny, or if they do, not very much. And one thing, if you look carefully, I'm sure somebody studied this type of topic before, and there are probably many reasons for this. But one thing I really noticed over the years when I read those patents is that many of those patents are trying to solve a problem that does not really exist. And that is really a fault of especially us in the ivory towers. We sit on the desk doing the research. We know our subject matter, we know our insect, our plant very well, but do we know the real problem? We really don't. Unless we go out there and mingle with our clientele group, we really don't know what's going on there. So that is probably one of the really important things we need to realize. If you want to invent something, just try to find out some problem that really exists. And one thing I do is that I try to communicate with people actually using some product for termite control. In my case, it's a termite control. I like to go find some termite control company. I go out there and kind of mingle around with them, go out to the field with them, listen to their complaint, look at what situation they have. And from there, sometimes I get some idea and say, there's a technological gap I can fill, okay? And the other source is the manufacturing company that actually produce product for this company to use. They are the one always listen or hear a lot of complaint from these people as well. And they are very good source if you listen to them and you can say, okay, here's the problem area, maybe we can address. And then we can just then come in, try to solve the problem. Now, as an expert on our field for our organism group, I don't think it's really difficult for us to solve the problem. Solving the problem is actually a very easy part of it. Find out what is a real problem, it's the most difficult part, in my opinion. Now, once you identify there's a problem area you can solve, you say, okay, I can zoom in and produce something to solve this problem. Now we move to the second step, is that really anybody try to commercialize this. And meaning commercialize this, meaning that the most important thing is that enough profit for them to make. Okay, you think the profit is something they can make more than they invested in, is good enough, it's not. Let's say that I have an idea, a product, and then I offer this one to commercial company. Let's say it takes them $10 million to ramp up the manufacturing process, buying the machine, hire people to do it, hire the manager to manage the entire process, hire the sales team, marketing team to market and sales those things. Let's say for them it's take $10 million to do, okay? And every year, if you can generate, they say, $1 million pure profit for the owner who invests this thing, is that good enough? It's not. Let's say the sales could be $3, $4 million, which seems to be good for $10 million investment. But if you take all the expense out, the pure profit for the person invested in is $1 million, he's not going to do it. Why? Because anybody can put $10 million in a bond, he can make 10%. Why does he want to risk this thing to invest the money to you to produce a product that may not work? He put the $10 million in the stock market these days, on average, he make 10%. So 10% is really not pure profit, it's not good enough. You have to be much more than that. And that is something that in academia we don't think about. If you go talk to commercial companies, sometimes they say, yeah, and you would think this one, the gross sale is going to be about $5 million if you invest $10 million, and within 2 years you can get your money back. You don't, because the expense of there is to knock out probably another $6, $7 million out of it, and then the profit is really minimum when it comes to compare with other ordinary investment they can do without any risk. So that's something that most of the faculty really don't think about. And we really have to think about in the other guy's shoes to see if my technology will not generate enough profit for this guy. I really want to have something that generates enough profit for them to beg me to license that technology. And that's my whole goal. I really want to identify the technology that will do that. So it really do not just because there's a problem there, I can solve it, I can produce a patent and put it out there, somebody will bite into my idea and commercialize that. It does not work out that way. You got to think through this entire thing to make sure you're solving the real problem, and the solution you provide can generate enough profit and more for the people who invest the money into your idea. And that's something we really need to think about. So I have 1 more minute, I think. Let me touch the basics of publication issue. And that is something that John talked about yesterday. Everybody worry about publish or perish, especially for young faculty. But from my own experience, I never have any conflict, never. If you're timing it right, you have a 12-month window to publish it or to patent it. So once you file a patent, you have a 12-month secrets period, and 1 year later, your idea on the patent is going to be disclosed to the public, okay? And But you have plenty of time to publish before then. If you do it right, and the other thing about patent issue is that patent does not have to work very well. You do not have to have a complete set of data to go to the examiner and say, hey, this and this one work. Examiner really does not care if it works or not sometimes. They only care about really important thing is prior art. If something, your idea somehow work reasonably well, that's fine. So you don't need a perfect data set to prove the concept works. I think my 8 minutes up. Thank you.
Dr. Su, those comments, particularly in putting yourself into the industry's shoes and connecting to the stakeholders and understanding the problems and challenges from their perspective, I think is a very good comment and certainly important in understanding to make sure that the relevance of the research meets with the needs and expectations of stakeholders. So thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Barry Tillman. And Barry, I will pull up the slides that you've provided.
Very good, John. Thank you. And this slide we can move on to the next slide. I just wanted to point out that I'm a plant breeder, and I'll just piggyback a little bit on what Dr. Su talked about. There's a lot of innovation taking place outside the university, of course, and we're not going to compete with multinational companies that have billion-dollar research budgets for a particular application. But there are a lot of companies that are smaller, a lot of industries that need university research that we may be the primary arm for research. And I think it's important for us to look at it from that perspective. I did work in industry for about 8 years before I came to academia, or back to academia. And of course, IP protection in an industry is the primary means of disclosing or publishing the work that they do. There was no emphasis on publication of journal articles in that particular case. Whereas in an academic setting, we are required to publish. And so our publications are probably our primary currency as faculty members, although our products are not only publications, but also graduate students and teaching from that aspect. And from my point of view, also extension products where we're extending our work, research work to the community that will utilize it. So in academics, as academics, we're both publishing and protecting, and I think that has to happen simultaneously. And it's important to look for applications that have commercial potential in your field of interest wherever you're working. Just so happens in plant breeding that what we're doing is always directed towards our industry. Unlike a commercial company developing corn or soybean or cotton, these large acreage crops where multinational companies are invested in the breeding effort, that is not the case in nearly all the crops that we work with in Florida. So we become the research arm for the seed producers and clients that are developing seed for growers through what we do. So my advice is to talk with, regardless of what you're doing, is to talk with OTL, which is now UF Innovate, or FFSP about possible inventions. And one thing that hasn't been mentioned is the use of material transfer agreements. If you're sharing knowledge or information or even preliminary products from your research with others, it's important to protect that through what's called a materials transfer agreement and make sure that, that it doesn't disclose and prevent you from applying for intellectual property protection by sharing with your colleagues. So just to also to echo the idea of publication. So I've worked here now for 16 years, protected 15 varieties, and one with utility patent. And really, John Butenmuller and John Byatt have offices that are great to work with. They file the paperwork for you. There's very little effort. You have to provide the data, of course, but there's very little effort on our part in terms of actually writing patents or writing PVPs. So I see really no conflict and no delay between publishing your work and in peer-reviewed journal articles as is our academic currency, but also protecting those is really important, and that can be done simultaneously. So next slide, John. just want to ask and answer this question: why is tech transfer important? From my perspective, I think the utilization of new technology is critical for our mission as well. You know, we don't want our patents to hang on the wall without any impact, and we don't want our journal articles to sit on a dusty shelf either and only be referenced. It would be great if they were actually utilized in our commercial sector to benefit the stakeholders. So one of the things that I like about being closer to that arena is that it helps align our research with the stakeholder needs. So as Dr. Sue said, we need to be involved in the stakeholder groups, our farming groups, or whatever groups we work with, to make sure that what we're doing actually aligns with what their needs are. And it's an important feedback loop in that arena. Is what we're working on being adopted? Is it being utilized by the industry? So just the question, does the technology work or not, will be answered if it's in the stakeholders' hands and they're using it and giving us feedback on those. So I think it really does point out the need for commercial partners. For our research, and I bet every grant that we write has some sort of an idea about how it's going to benefit society or how it's going to have an impact. But those impacts are not realized unless they get into the commercial sector and are actually utilized by the public in general, or at least by the stakeholders. So I think the benefit is that it creates opportunity for interaction that might not otherwise be present, might not be there unless we're really focused on the technology being implemented in the marketplace. And I think greater societal impact of our research should be one of our goals, and I know from an Ifas standpoint it almost always is. We talk about feeding a hungry world, and to do that, our work has to get into the hands that can make that happen. Another aspect that we haven't talked about much, and I know that you know, the dollars and cents are not the most important part, but at least in our area, it does provide funding for research. These intellectual property filings that we commercialize do provide a steady, it's not always large. In fact, it's rarely a large pot of money for funding research, but it is usually steady, and it's an important part of our feedback loop. I think if we see the funding or the money that these generate growing, then we're certain that the industry is using them and it's having a benefit to our stakeholders. So that funding for research then is reinvested into the program to move forward with further research, and it's not just used for direct support of a research program, but I've used it for graduate student funding to help generate data for grant applications in the future as well. So I think it's important to note the funding aspect for research. And if you look on the websites, you can see that there's also personal benefit. You will earn royalties personally, at least you and your team will earn royalties personally for these. So there's a benefit. I know you know, we've really worked hard, I think, in Ifas and across the university to allow faculty to write their salaries into the grants that they write. So it's the same sort of idea that you are not only conducting research, but benefiting and paying the important salary parts that are conducting that research. So I think the technology transfer, at least from my perspective, in academia has been very smooth, very easy, and very beneficial from several standpoints. And just to summarize, that's the stakeholder interactions and being able to see the work being utilized by our stakeholders, and then funding for research as well as the personal benefit. So with that, I'll pass it on, John, to Marcio.
Perfect. Thank you, Barry. And I think, you know, your comments there as well in the feedback loop and understanding the needs of stakeholders and making sure that the research is aligned echoes some of what Dr. Sue shared as well, I think is very important. Our next speaker is Dr. Marcio Resende. Just a reminder, everybody, please do submit if you have any questions. Use the Zoom Q&A function to submit questions, and after Dr. Resende finishes, we will move into a question and answer session. So, Dr. Resende.
Thank you, John. And thank you everyone for hanging around. I know it's approaching lunchtime, so I'll try to be brief. But John asked me to talk about startup creation, which is a topic I enjoy talking about. And when you think about tech transfer, usually technologies that are lower risk, high reward are usually the ones that are picked up by large established companies that will license and put it forward. But technologies that are high risk and high reward, they often find themselves in a limbo where university finished its development, but it's still too early stage for a large company to pick up and license it. So in my opinion, that's where academic spin-offs, they fit well as a mean of tech transfer. And before I actually talk about the company that we created, I wanted to talk about a University of Florida spin-off that was founded in 1998 to create, my understanding was a tooled allograft, was a engineered bone that was used in orthopedic surgeries. And this company went public in 2000, and the proceeds of what University of Florida collected with royalties and sale of stocks was used to build, part of it was used to build the Cancer and Genetics Research Center, the CGRC. And that building was where I came to do my PhD, and later co-developed the technology that led to the creation of the startup. So I just think it's a nice story of a cycle and an impact that this approach to tech transfer can have. So in my case, the idea to start a company actually originated well before I was in my master's. Wait, I had some issues with my internet. Can you guys still hear me? Okay, I think so. I was in my master's and I was developing, back in Brazil, and I was developing statistical algorithms to use DNA information to accelerate plant breeding. But at the time, there wasn't any company or any technology that could generate this DNA information. So there was a great demand and a great interest from industry to use these algorithms, but there wasn't a way to actually have access to the DNA marker information. So I wanted to, the rationale at the time, the mission at the time was always to be able to translate my research and to get it used out there. I didn't know how to do it, and it wasn't until actually I came to UF to do a PhD, started working in Matthias Kirst's lab, that we co-developed the method to do so, and then that idea to open a company came back. So UF then patented this method to cost efficiently generate DNA markers, and helped us along the way to actually co-found the company, resolve all conflict of interests. We licensed exclusively the technology from UF, and then established the genotyping and genetic data analysis company with the goal to accelerate, to help breeding programs accelerate their process. So the company now exists for about 10 years. We have about 25 employees, and serve clients all over the world. I think we have over 60 different countries that send samples. And we have hired several UF alumni, undergrad and graduate students. In many ways, it was a stepping stone for students to go to their next job. So there's a story of a computer science undergrad that he was working at a gym to pay for college. We brought him to the company he quit his job at the gym. We brought him to the company to do internship. And he later told us that that was experience that allowed him to get an internship at Microsoft. He then went to Microsoft to work full-time there. He's probably making more money than I do. And when he left, he brought another of his colleagues to continue the internship. That student went on to also work for Microsoft, and both of them were currently in Seattle. So I think that's one of the rewarding parts of it. When I think about impact, when I think about the advantages, the impact is really the motivation for me. The idea, the ability to put the research beyond publications and actually reach more than what a paper can reach. Obviously, that's not exclusive to a startup. Extension does that very well. Plant breeding do that as well. But when I look back to the companies that back in Brazil wanted to use genomic selection, wanted to use markers to accelerate the breeding, some of them did because we founded the company. So that was definitely a very good thing to look back and see what happened. Another personal advantage in my case is that my background was in tree breeding. I worked with trees at the time. And through the startup, I was able to actually work with genomics and breeding of corn, of fruits, of vegetables, and it just broadened my experience as a researcher. And he gave me some experiences that I think I can now translate to this job, such as project management and managing budgets and keeping people motivated. I think overall, there were several advantages that I now see as a faculty. Obviously, faculty creating startups are not something that happen every day. They're somewhat of a rare occurrence. There are some disadvantages just on the time it takes for planning and how you definitely need a team around to make it happen, because we all nowadays have our day jobs. And I'll just take one more minute to just wrap around on funding. So in our case, we were able to find investors that bought the idea and put the funding to set the company. UF now has a fund that John Byatt briefly mentioned about, which is UF Innovate Ventures. And the federal funding, federal agencies, they also have a few different mechanisms to fund startups. And one of them is SBIR and STTR. These are grants that go to the new business to fund research that will then, the vision is that will lead to economic development. And the last one that I participated a few years ago was, it's called I-Core. It's funded, there's NSF I-Core, there's NIH I-Core. The idea is a grant that comes to the PI, to the university researcher, to do customer discovery. So you're able to take your idea, your research idea, and explore what is really the need out there. So I think I'm right about 8 or 9 minutes, so I'll be glad to talk more if anyone has any questions, but those were the points I had to share. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Marcia. Yeah, it's very, very interesting. I think certainly you look at the startup creation and everything that goes into that, you know, it really is an excellent opportunity to bridge that gap where you may have a technology or an idea that doesn't fit, you know, in the market. And so it is necessary to create a new company around that technology. And you look at the economic development and job creation, there's a lot of benefits to that, and certainly a lot of resources for support at the University of Florida. So thank you. We do have a couple minutes, I believe, and we have one question that's been submitted. Please, if you do have a question, go ahead and submit it now. But first question we have is, does UF Innovate fund novel ideas? And so, John, I will send that over your way.
Yeah, so we don't fund novel ideas. What we do fund, we have something called a commercialization fund. And so if we receive an invention disclosure and we invest in that invention disclosure by filing patent rights, often is the case that a company or a startup says, okay, this looks really interesting, and we might license this technology if there's a prototype, or if you have in vivo results, or you've done, you know, some certain study to help de-risk it. So in those cases, we say, okay, you know, what would it take to create that prototype or do the animal studies that would help the company make a decision to license it? And so we will use some of that commercialization money to do those studies to help you know, get it to the point where it's going to be licensed. So we have some money there. The venture fund invests in companies which have already been founded, and usually the venture fund doesn't invest in the very first money to go into a company, but they will invest in a later round. So to answer the question, we don't fund new ideas. You know, that money has to come from, well, usually grants. But later ideas, we're able to put some investment in there.
Great, thank you. Well, no, I haven't seen any additional questions come across, but I would want to thank our panel for their participation in the session today, and certainly wish we could have had the interaction and engagement in person, but something to look forward to here, hopefully in the not too distant future. But thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Gilbert, who I believe has some closing remarks for the Ifas Research Forum.
Thank you, John, and thanks to all the panelists in this and all the sessions today. I really appreciated all their hard work in this busy time to help our faculty. I think one perhaps positive thing from COVID-19 is the amount of people who attended all these research forums, which you probably couldn't do if we were in person. So we had over 130 at one point today. We had several hundred other meetings. So I think that overall has been a positive thing, although yes, we would like to have been in person. Our next and final forum session is on September 25th, so please mark your calendars for that as well. And with that, I wish everyone a great day and a wonderful weekend. Stay safe. Thank you.